Hello dreamers, and welcome to Haunted Sleep. This is the place where eerie tales and calming whispers meet, helping you drift into peaceful sleep with a touch of mystery. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if you're enjoying these nightly journeys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell, so you never miss a night of chilling calm. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. I guess I should start by saying that I've always believed in the supernatural. When I was a child, I had a friend I called Angel. My mother believes that Angel was the ghost of my grandmother, who passed away when I was just 9 months old. As I got older, I had more experiences that made me question the boundary between the living and the supernatural. One experience occurred when I was a teenager. A friend of mine and I were in an old apartment building his father was helping to restore. We went up to the top floor where there was a door leading to the attic. The door had been locked for as long as the building had been there, and no one had opened it in years. The stories of the building being haunted never bothered us until we were on that floor. Suddenly, the doorknob to the attic door began to rattle violently, as if someone was trying to get out. Knowing the door hadn't been unlocked in years, my friend and I screamed and ran out of the building. Once we were outside, we looked up at the window, and what we saw made my blood run cold. There, in the window, was a small child with a bloodied hole in her forehead. Then, a shadowy figure grabbed her and dragged her away from the window. We never spoke of it again, but it was something I'll never forget. When I got older, my family moved into a 200-plus-year-old house. I never liked this house. There was something dark about it. At night, I would hear strange noises coming from my closet, like something was trapped behind the wall. The cracks under the stairs would glow, even though the basement light wasn't on. I would also hear footsteps upstairs when no one was home or awake. As I reached my teens, the experiences became more frequent. I didn't hear them as often as when I was younger, but I still heard whispers in the night, footsteps in the hall, and voices coming from the basement. One night, my brothers and I were walking our dog near a park pavilion when my oldest brother and I heard voices coming from the woods. The voices felt wrong, dark, and dangerous. My stepbrother couldn't understand why we were so eager to leave, but I don't think he ever will. But none of this could prepare me for the day I made contact with my first demon. It happened just a few months ago, on my best friend Nico's 17th birthday. Nico, myself, and our 2 other friends, Corey and Trish, were hanging out in Nico's room, doing what teenage girls do. Nico turned to me and asked if I wanted to do a meditation session with her. I had a bad feeling about it. Every time Nico and I did one of these sessions, something went wrong. She would often lose consciousness for a few minutes, only to wake up with little or no recollection of what had happened. Despite my reservations, she insisted, and I reluctantly agreed. We called it meditation, but it was more like a trance or hypnotism. I'm a practicing Wiccan/pagan, so I didn't think much of it, but something didn't feel right this time. As we began the session, just like before, things started to go wrong. Nico began describing a boy she had seen in her visions during previous sessions. His name was Dylan, and to put it simply, he was evil. I walked Nico through the process of describing what she saw, felt, and heard. With every passing moment, things grew worse. Her breathing became rapid, and her body temperature dropped to the point where her hands felt clammy and ice cold. Then, she slumped forward into my lap, unconscious. I called her name, trying to wake her up. After a couple of minutes, she stirred and came to. Corey quickly turned on the lights, and we all asked her if she was okay. What she did next surprised us all. She dove for the light switch, turned it off, and ran to the window, gazing out at the snow. "He's coming," she whispered. We asked her who, but she just kept telling us to be quiet. Then she laid down on the floor, stretching out her arms towards the door. Her hands were still a good 3 or 4 feet from the door, but that's when the scratching started. At first, I thought it was Trish messing around to scare us, but when I looked, I saw her hands were on top of the blankets we were under, not even close to the door. The scratching continued for what felt like 5 minutes. Trish was crying, Corey was on the verge of tears, and I was frozen, my muscles locked, my fingers curled tightly into the blanket. When the scratching finally stopped, Nico stood up, turned the lights on, and gave us the most confused look ever. She didn't remember anything. We told her what had happened, but she just brushed it off, telling us to stop messing with her. We weren't messing with her. This was my first real encounter with Dylan. Several days later, Trish called me and told me that Nico had done several sessions of absent writing. This is where someone goes into a trance and writes automatically. The things Nico had written were chilling. "Her blood is mine, she is mine, you can't save her," and other similar threats. I immediately turned to my goddesses for guidance. As I spoke about a fire protection spell I had found, the flame on my candle shot up 6 inches and stayed there for about 30 seconds before dulling down again. I took this as a sign. I gathered my supplies and went to Nico's house. We were actually staying at our friend Alexis's house, where we planned to perform the spell. Before we began, I had my second encounter with Dylan. He was very unhappy that I was there, and I knew I was the only one who could protect Nico from him. I wasn't afraid of him. With the love and guidance of my goddesses, I knew I was doing the right thing. To show he didn't want me there, Dylan tried to force Nico to cut herself with a pin. I grabbed her hand to stop her, and in the process I got stabbed. After that, we went downstairs to perform the spell. Trish and Alexis stayed outside, fearing something bad might happen. Nico and I performed the spell on our own, and as we waited for the candles to burn out, Trish and Alexis came back inside. We all watched as Trish's breath arched around the outside of our circle, as if it hit an invisible wall. It's been over 6 months since I cast that spell, and I know that Nico is now protected. Using my spirit board, not a Ouija board, we discovered that Nico has several very powerful deities watching over and protecting her. The protection spell worked, and Dylan's activities have quieted down. But Nico still tells me he's there. I can feel him when I'm with her. I don't think we'll ever be fully rid of him, but for now, I can only hope and keep trying to protect her. I guess I should start by saying this. I've always believed in the supernatural. Growing up, my family had a long history with it, but since my great-grandmother passed, I seem to be the only one who embraced it, rather than treating it like some kind of disease. To understand my ghost stories, you need to know a bit about my past, my history. Funeral homes. They're not just the setting for horror movies or shows like My Girl. They are real places. In fact, I lived in one for the first 4 years of my life. A funeral home in Cleveland, Ohio. My grandparents were thrilled when their 17-year-old daughter, my mother, became pregnant. They weren't the typical parents. However, my mom didn't choose the best man to have a child with. 9 months later, my older sister was born. Her father was kicked out, and quickly ended up in prison. My mom decided to live with her parents in my grandfather's funeral home, where she raised my sister. And not long after, I was conceived there too. It wasn't long before my father moved in as well, and they all lived as a family in this very unusual home. Still with me? Here's where my story starts. One day, my grandparents decided to take a car ride, enjoying their day off. My father went to work at a company called Rollcraft. No idea what they did, and my sister, who was now 8, went off to school. While the house was empty, my mother went into labor. By the time everyone got home, it was too late. I arrived quickly, too quickly. My mother was taken downstairs, and I was born next to a young man named David, who had passed away in a car accident earlier that day. This isn't fiction, this is my life. The basement in that funeral home was divided into 2 sections, the body room, and mine and my sister's playroom, where we spent most of the day and took our naps. It was in that playroom that I had my very first experience that I can remember. I was 3 years old. But before I get into that, there's more you need to know. On my father's side, there were spiritual members of the Cherokee tribe. On my mother's side, there was a mix of Hungarian and German gypsies. Most of the women in my mother's family had a strong connection to the paranormal, but they treated it as something to be ashamed of, a sickness, something unholy. My mother had even gotten herself blessed by a Catholic priest at 16 because she was terrified of her gifts, and she swore that she would be the last one in the family to have such experiences. When my sister was growing up, she showed no signs of the family baggage. Then I was born. My mother once told me that when I was an infant, I would often laugh at the wall or babble to people who weren't there. All the signs that my sister lacked, I had. This brings me back to my first real experience, now that you know my history. The bed in the playroom where my sister and I slept was old, comfortable, but old. The footboard was rotting, and the headboard was completely gone. I remember a small space between the mattress and the wall. The bed was much taller than I was, so it took a little bit of a climb to get in and out. I was a late bloomer, still sleeping with a pacifier despite my mother's best efforts to get me to stop. It comforted me, but it also did damage to my teeth. One day, my sister got permission to stay with a friend, and it was nearing nap time for me. I remember my mother picking me up and taking me downstairs. She was tired too, so she decided to nap with me. We went downstairs, and she placed me in the bed. It didn't take long for her to fall asleep, leaving me alone in the dark. I played with my pacifier between my fingers and felt it slip away from me, falling between the mattress and the wall. Curious and fearless, I scooted my head toward the crack to see if I could spot my pacifier. To my horror, all I saw were a pair of bright, clear eyes staring back at me. I yelped for my mother and shook her, but nothing seemed to wake her. Fear overtook me, and I did what most children do when they're scared. I threw the blankets over my head and squeezed my eyes shut. I waited in silence, unsure of how much time passed. I wondered, why hasn't it gotten me yet? I slowly removed the covers just enough to peek out, and there, next to me on the bed, was a dark, outlined shape. I reached out, and there it was, my pacifier, sitting right in my hand, as if it had never fallen. I'll never know if this was a paranormal experience, the first of many to come, or if it was just a product of my imagination. All I know is that I stayed in that bed until my mother woke up, and after that, I never napped downstairs again. From that day on, a child who had never feared the dark started fearing what might be hidden in it. That fear didn't fully dissipate until nearly 3 years ago. That was my first experience with the paranormal, and the first of many ghost stories. Writing this felt more productive than keeping a journal. I hope you enjoy reading about my life in the paranormal. Good night. This story took place in early August 2011, and it's the one incident that truly made me believe in spirits. It all started with my 3-year-old son, who turned 3 in September. Before this experience, I had always believed in spirits, both human and unholy, but I had never actually encountered anything personally. My dad was a minister of a strict Christian apostolic church in Carrollton, Kentucky, and I would often hear his stories about evil spirits that conflicted with him throughout his life because of his strong faith in God. My mom would share similar stories, but hers were more about haunted houses and strange entities. I'll tell those stories another time, but for now, let's get to the one that truly changed everything for me. One night, I was at my apartment. I had just said goodbye to my dad and a longtime friend who had come by to watch a Reds game. Ironically, during the slow, dull baseball game, we ended up telling ghost stories. It seemed random, but my dad always told some pretty scary ones. I bring this up because I feel it might have had something to do with what happened next. I had lived in the apartment for months, and nothing unusual had ever occurred, until this night. It was about 10:30 p.m. when I said goodbye to my friend and my father. I was cleaning up a bit while my 3-year-old son was playing around the house, like usual. I was in the living room cleaning, and my son was in the kitchen, shooting his toy gun. Out of nowhere, I heard him clearly say. Ouch, no Johnny, that hurt. Now, we don't know anyone named Johnny. No cartoons, no toys, no pets, nothing he knows goes by that name. It struck me as odd. I walked over to him and asked, Who's Johnny? He pointed at the kitchen wall and said, Johnny, right there in the hole in the wall. Any parent knows when a child is just rambling or when they're genuinely seeing something. My son was looking at the wall as if there was someone there. I froze, my heart racing. I quickly dressed him and left the apartment. As I was driving to a friend's house, I remembered something that happened when I first moved into the building. There was an older woman who lived just 2 doors down from me. I had seen her one day as I was coming into the building. She was walking her 2 small dogs outside, and as I entered the building to head to my apartment, her dogs followed me to my door. I didn't think much of it at the time, but she called her dogs back and apologized, saying, Sorry, I used to live there, just moved 3 weeks ago after my husband died. We lived there for 12 years. I was taken aback and asked, He died in there? She said, No, he passed away elsewhere, but I left because of the memories. I couldn't handle it anymore. That struck me. She never gave me her husband's name, and I decided I would sleep on it and talk to her the next day. The next day, I went back to my apartment on the east side of Cincinnati and knocked on her door. When she answered, I said, Before I tell you something strange, I have to ask, what was your late husband's name? She replied, John. Chills engulfed my body. I was stunned. I told her the story of what happened with my son and how he had met Johnny the night before. She began to cry. Then she pulled out a photo of her late husband. I showed my son the picture and asked, Who's this? Without hesitation, he said, Johnny, Daddy. In that moment, I knew without a doubt that spirits do inhabit parts of this earth. My son had met Johnny, and there was no denying it. I'm a security officer, but I won't mention the company I work for, as I don't think it's appropriate. For the sake of this story, though, I was assigned to a hospital. That's all I'll say about the facility. As a security officer, I don't have any more authority than an average citizen. What I do is something anyone could do. The difference is that I get paid for it. My job is to protect lives and property, following the client's procedures. I stay alert and use all my senses while on patrol, eyes, ears, and a nose for trouble. When I encounter something unusual, I try to make a visual identification before contacting the authorities or writing a report, except for field notes, of course. Most of the time, it's just minor things, like a coffee pot left on, a burnout light, or a rodent out for a late-night snack. Occasionally, it's kids who shouldn't be on the property. But on the night of August 26, 2022, I could only speculate about what I heard. I couldn't say for sure who or what it was, but I know it wasn't normal. My report was professional, but what I'm about to share with you is more like a true story. I was on 3rd shift, patrolling the terrace level. I had just finished my patrol and was about to head toward the elevator when I heard something strange. It was around 4 a.m. as I was checking an exit door. The sound that reached my ears was faint at first, but unmistakable. It sounded like a group of men shouting instructions to each other, as if they were in the middle of a high-stress situation, like the orders you'd hear at a construction site. The only construction area in the building was in the old wing, not too far from where I was. That's strange, I thought. No one should be down here at this hour. I had just come from the old wing, and I knew for a fact that there was no one there. Maintenance wouldn't be arriving for another hour, and I hadn't received any calls on my company's cell phone. I was puzzled. Who could be down here at this time? I asked myself as I continued my patrol of the terrace. I checked everywhere, every nook and cranny, including the old wing and the mechanical room, but there was no one there. Everything was quiet, normal, or eerie. The spot where I had first heard the conversation was now dead silent. I then moved on to the nurses' stations on the floors above, hoping to find some answers. "Is everything okay?" I asked as I checked in with the nurses. "Everything is fine," they replied. "We'll call you if we need you." I got the same response from the nurses' station right above the area where I had heard the conversation. Maybe it was possible that the sound of voices from the floors above had somehow traveled down through the pipes or ventilation system. I had no real explanation, but I figured that might account for it. I also checked the entrances to the terrace level and found no one outside. I did this before reporting back to the nurses. There was no one around, and nothing going on that would explain the sounds I heard. About a half hour later, around 4:45 a.m., I did another sweep of the terrace. This time, I heard the faint sound of clanging metal. I checked the mechanical rooms, maintenance, and the old wing again, but everything was quiet. I couldn't find the source of the noise, and I was starting to get frustrated. Running around like this was making me run late on my rounds, and I wasn't happy about it. The only explanation I could come up with was that the sound of a conversation had traveled through the vents or pipes. Maybe it was distorted by the time it reached me, which could have made it sound like men shouting orders. As for the clanging sound, it's an old building. It's bound to make some odd noises. I filed a report on the incident, but I didn't indicate anything more than that I couldn't locate the source of the sounds. I'm sure that went over well with my superiors. When I first started working at this hospital, another officer mentioned some strange occurrences on the terrace level. He said things like lights turning on by themselves after being switched off, doors found wide open, and strange light sources appearing out of nowhere. I didn't pay much attention to him at the time. I figured he was just trying to spook the new guard. However, I've since witnessed a few odd things myself, like elevators opening and closing when there's no one inside. It's nothing I'd bother reporting though. I've had a long history with the paranormal, both my family and myself. This particular experience is one of the ones I most want to share, though it's difficult to explain. I suspect it could be ghostly activity, but I'm not 100% sure. And if it was ghostly, I don't claim to understand what that means. I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether mundane or supernatural. When I was around 12 years old, in the late 80s, my family rented an old farmhouse in rural Ohio. We rented it from an older gentleman who had been a friend of my father's family for years. The house had been built by his grandfather around 1900, and someone in his family had lived there until just a few years prior when he built a smaller home about 3 miles away. Before us, the house had been rented to one person. The house was large, big enough for all 3 of us girls to have our own rooms. My room was on the 2nd floor, directly across from the stairs to the 1st floor. I immediately noticed a few odd things about the house. After I went to bed, I began hearing footsteps coming up the stairs. I assumed it was my mother staying up late to unpack. But I quickly realized something strange. Not only did the footsteps never stop, they didn't go back down the stairs. They were only coming up. The footsteps continued all night, echoing up the stairs until I eventually fell asleep. But that wasn't the only thing keeping me awake. Around my bed, I could see the shadows of people, figures gathering around me, staring at me. It's hard to describe exactly what they looked like. They were the size of average adults, but they had a shadowy, almost translucent form, like someone standing in front of a bright light. They had a strange, blue aura around them, which pulsed with an electric-like glow. Feeling unnerved, I curled up in the middle of the bed, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to sleep, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as these things continued to happen every night, I decided I needed to figure out what was going on. I experimented with a few things. I wondered if the shadows appeared when the light was off, or if they could be blocked by my curtains. I tried sitting up instead of lying down, or leaving my door open. I found that I could only see the shadows if the light was off. I could hear the footsteps unless I kept my door closed or had the radio on loud enough to drown out the sounds. None of these were good options for sleeping. I also noticed that the footsteps didn't start until everyone else in the house was in bed, but the shadows always appeared as soon as I turned off the light. I was scared, so I tried to come up with a logical explanation. I convinced myself that it was some sort of optical and auditory illusion, my eyes and ears reacting to the darkness and silence. I thought I might have been hearing sounds from the day or seeing residue of people I had encountered earlier. After all, I had seen shadows like this before, just not in the same way. I was still scared, but I tried to tell myself this was all normal. Then things took a turn. My little sister, around 5 years old, started having night terrors. Not just nightmares, real, intense terrors. 3 or 4 times a week, she would wake up the whole household, screaming and crying. It took a while to wake her and calm her down. On the nights she didn't wake us, she would come into my room saying she was scared and couldn't sleep. So I let her sleep with me. I didn't really connect her night terrors to the strange things happening around the house, though plenty of kids experienced them. But, as you'll see, the coincidences made me wonder. We moved out of that house when I was 17. Immediately after moving, I noticed I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. It seemed odd to me, given my theory about optical and auditory illusions. The shadows also faded. Instead of seeing several every night, I would only see one occasionally. I told myself it was just a change in conditions, something that had altered the way I perceived things. But then my mother told me something. She said that at the old house, she had been disturbed by the constant rattling of the attic door, which led up from her bedroom. She wasn't sure what it was but wondered if it could be a ghost. My mom had always believed in ghosts, but we never talked about it much. We agreed it was probably just a draft. It wasn't until about 5 years later, when my sister was 16, that I began to seriously doubt my theory. Her night terrors had mostly stopped as she got older, and they had really dwindled after we moved. Still, she had them occasionally, and she refused to sleep without the TV on in her room. One night, we were talking about her night terrors, and she casually mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She had seen people around her bed. I was taken aback. I asked her what she meant, and she described the exact same shadowy figures I had seen as a child. I told her it was just an optical illusion, that it happened to everyone. But she didn't believe me. She said she had asked several of her friends over the years, and none of them knew what she was talking about. At that point, I began to seriously doubt my explanation. Optical illusions are supposed to be consistent, but this was something different. A few years later, when my daughter was 8, she started having nightmares, something she'd never experienced before. I tried to comfort her, and asked what she was dreaming about. She told me she was dreaming about black and blue people coming to get her. This terrified me, but I didn't want her to know how scared I was. I bought her a dream catcher, and powered it to protect her, and the nightmares stopped immediately. Recently, as my daughter is now a teenager, I told her about my experiences with the shadows and what she had said when she was younger. She didn't remember the details clearly, but she still has the dream catcher hanging above her bed. She told me she wouldn't be taking it with her when she goes to college in a few weeks. I still don't know what to think about the footsteps. Maybe they were just the result of something mundane, but I've never been able to shake the idea that they were always coming up the stairs. The shadows are more of an issue for me. I've looked into shadow people and other apparitions, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. I'm not sure if they felt threatening or if I was just scared because I didn't understand what they were. A year or 2 ago, I decided to remove the mental blocks I'd put up to stop seeing them. I've seen occasional shadows since then, but they seem further away than they did when I was younger. So I still wonder, what were those shadows? And what about the footsteps? Were they just my imagination, or is there something more to it? I'm not sure, but the experiences still linger with me to this day. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I'm an Ohio State Police patrolman, and on July 23, 2009, I was on patrol in Clark County. I was en route to the Clark County OSP barracks to deliver paperwork on a case that had been continued from Union County. As I was driving, my car suddenly flashed all over my unit and then stalled completely. I managed to coast the car to a nearby farmhouse on the county road I was traveling. I parked in the driveway and noticed an elderly gentleman walking by the barn. He glanced my way but then continued on into the barn. I tried to start my car again, but it was completely dead. I attempted to reach dispatch on the radio, but I couldn't get through. I noticed a high-power transmission line running next to the property, and realized my handheld radio wouldn't work unless I moved further away. I decided to walk to the farmer's house to use his phone, as I couldn't get a cell signal either. I walked out to the barn where the old man had gone and called out, "Hello?" as I opened what appeared to be a door to the milk parlor. When no one answered, I called out again, a little louder this time. Still hearing nothing, I turned to walk toward the house, thinking maybe I had missed him. But as I turned, he was suddenly standing behind me. It startled me at first. He had no expression on his face when he asked if I was having car trouble. I replied, "Yes," and asked if I could borrow his phone. He pointed toward the house and said we could walk there or use the milk parlor if I wasn't going to be long because he was getting ready to milk. He even asked if I wanted some water while I waited. I thanked him and said the parlor would suffice. I followed him into the barn, and he walked off to attend to something. I used his phone to call dispatch and let them know where I was. They told me a wrecker would be out in under an hour. After I hung up, the farmer returned, wiping his hands with a grease rag, saying he had been working on the pump motor for the milking machine. I told him what dispatch had said, and he offered to help me push my car to the road so the wrecker would find it more easily. I told him if it wasn't in the way, they could pick it up there, but he replied, "Nay, they never look in the driveway, so we best push it to the road." He said I could set my glass on the picnic table and that I should get in and steer while he pushed. Since the driveway sloped downhill, he managed to push the car fairly easily. Once we reached the edge of the road, I sat in my cruiser and waited for the tow truck. When the driver arrived and got out, he looked up at the farm, visibly nervous, and said, "We need to hurry and get out of here." I reassured him that everything was fine. When we got to the barracks garage, the other officers were standing outside. They seemed concerned about my well-being and asked how things had gone at the farm. I said everything went fine. They pressed further, asking, "Did you talk to the old farmer?" I said he didn't say much, just helped me push my car to the street. The wrecker driver, who had been listening, then looked at me and asked, "You don't know?" I said, "No, what do you mean?" He told me that, in the early 70s, a farmer had shot himself in the milk parlor of that farm, and no one had lived there since the mid-80s because it was considered haunted. I was shocked. I didn't know what to think. The officer with me said, "Let's go take a look." So we drove out there. When we arrived at the farm, it was run down and abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. I had the officer pull into the driveway, and there, sitting on the picnic table, was my glass, the one I had set down earlier. We went to the barn, and the milk parlor was covered in dust, but oddly, the phone had fresh fingerprints on it, as if it had been used recently. I picked up the phone, but there was no dial tone. That really freaked me out, and I said, "We can go now." The officer, a paranormal enthusiast, had a lot of questions, but I was ready to leave. When we returned to the barracks, my car had been repaired. It turned out the positive cable had come off the starter, and where the farmer had helped me push the car, there were greasy handprints on the bumper. I've driven back to that farm since then, but the house is gone. Apparently, someone torched it. But to this day, just thinking about it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. I was still 9 years old, the same summer that I had that strange encounter with the bank man in the tea room. My sister and I were excited to spend time with our aunt and uncle in their new home. At first, it wasn't the house itself that scared me. It was what was in it. We settled in that first night, ordered pizza, played games, and watched movies. My uncle had to get up early for work, so around midnight, what I thought was late back then, we all decided to call it a night. We slowly headed up the stairs, and I let my sister take the lead. The dark made me hesitate, but once I saw the lights ahead, I felt relief and stepped into what would be our room. My aunt worked as a flight attendant and often flew internationally. One of her favorite destinations was Egypt, and she was fascinated by the culture. She became somewhat obsessed with it, collecting tons of small items on each trip, as well as at least one large item. The room we slept in was filled with Egyptian paintings, statuettes, musical instruments, and hieroglyphics. It was so full of things to look at that I was excited to sleep there, until the lights went out. My sister fell asleep quickly, but I tried my best to keep her awake, hoping she'd talk to me and distract me from the eerie atmosphere. It didn't work. She was out like a light, and I was left alone in the dark. The blanket was green and knitted, but no matter how hard I tried to wrap myself in it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the strange movements at the corners of my eyes. The room slowly filled with sounds, faint music from the instruments in the room. Then voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up, looking around. Everything was still. The music came and went, and the voices faded in and out, like whispers that didn't belong. I checked the house, 3 times in total, to see if there were any explanations for the sounds, a TV left on, music playing somewhere else, but there was nothing. Each time I returned to the room, the music would start again, and only when I stepped out did it stop. My curiosity began to outweigh my fear. I listened to the voices and the music, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then something changed. The statues, the little men on the shelves and walls, slowly began to move. Their eyes followed each other, then me, then my sister, as she adjusted in her sleep. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. These weren't ordinary figurines. The music started to soothe me, but that feeling of unease never left. Then I heard it, a distinct crack. A statue in particular, the largest one, the one I had been watching most of the night, suddenly cracked. I watched, horrified, as its arms began to break off its body. The music grew louder, and the beat quickened. My heart raced as I screamed and jumped out of bed, running for the door. But before I could escape, I found myself face to face with a woman. She stood in front of me, her deep brown eyes sparkling as she stared at the statues. She didn't seem to notice me at all, as if I wasn't even there. Her hair was straight, held back by a golden band, and she wore a simple outfit that barely covered her. She looked like she belonged to another time, another place. I must have been in shock, because I just stood there, frozen. "Hello?" I whispered, unsure what else to say. She didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge me at all. She simply turned gracefully and walked toward the stairs, vanishing into a light mist as she descended. In an instant, I was alone again. The sounds of music were gone. The voices faded away, and the room fell silent. But the fear lingered thick in the air. I stayed in the hallway until my uncle came downstairs for work. When he saw me, he asked, "What's wrong?" I didn't know how to answer. What could I say? What was I supposed to say? I had just seen someone, or something, who wasn't supposed to be there. I told him, "I don't like that room. I don't want to sleep in there." He smiled, took my hand, and said, "I don't like that room either. Weird things make for a difficult sleep," looking back at the room with a knowing look. It was the first time I felt normal about what I had experienced. My uncle led me downstairs and set me up on the couch. He kissed my forehead and left for work. The sun had come up, and as the day began, I was just getting to sleep. But every now and then, I would glance at the foot of the stairs, half expecting to see the mist again. This story begins when I was about 7 years old. My mom and aunts threw a huge Halloween party for all the kids in the family. There were 16 of us, ranging in age from about 5 to 13. It was an awesome time, but the coolest part came when it got really dark outside. We took a hayride to a cemetery a few miles down the road from my aunt and uncle's house, where the party was being held. My mom told us stories about the people buried there, including one about a man who wasn't resting in peace because of his wrongful death, a typical spooky urban legend. When we arrived at the cemetery, the adults told us they wanted to show us the grave of this man and his ghost, who supposedly sought revenge for his death. The air was thick with excitement and fear as we crept through the cemetery toward the largest tombstone. Just as we were halfway there, my dad and uncles jumped out from behind the gravestones, wearing creepy masks. The kids screamed and ran straight for the wagon while the ghosts and moms laughed. For years, the adults would retell the story of how scared we looked and how we panicked trying to get away. Fast forward to when I was a teenager. My sister and 2 cousins decided it was time to get our parents back for their prank. Our parents got together once a month for a card game, so we planned to carry out our revenge that October. We waited until our dads went for a beer run, which always meant an hour or 2 at the bar. Then, we convinced our moms to take us to see the grave of a sad ghost who, according to a legend we made up, could be seen weeping at her husband's grave when the moonlight hit it just right. My cousin secretly called his best friend, who agreed to meet us at the cemetery in a mask and hide to scare the adults. The prank worked perfectly. Our moms were terrified, almost to the point of peeing themselves. We laughed so hard as we drove back to the car. But things took an odd turn after that. When we tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. We laughed it off, joking that the ghost had sabotaged it. We decided to walk to my cousin's friend's car instead, planning to have our dads drive back and get the car later. But when we got there, his car wouldn't start either. It was strange because neither car had had any issues recently. At this point, we started to feel a little uneasy, but what else could we do? This was before everyone had cell phones, so we began walking towards the nearest house, which was about a mile or 2 away. Though we didn't know the family well, we knew their name. When we reached the house, we noticed that it was eerily dark, and there were no cars in the driveway. We knocked, but there was no answer. Just as we were about to leave, disappointed, we heard voices coming from the back of the house. Curious, we went around the back, calling out, "Hello," and introducing ourselves, but still, no one answered. The backyard had a lot of trees, and then, out of nowhere, large branches began to fall from the trees around us. It was terrifying, especially since there was no wind, no cause for it. Within a few seconds, at least a dozen branches, each bigger than our arms, fell to the ground. We bolted, running down the driveway in fear. But just as we reached the end of the driveway, my cousin screamed and pointed toward the house. It looked like several pairs of glowing red eyes were peering around the corner of the house at us. We ran back to our car, tried the engine again, and it started without a problem. We didn't stop at my cousin's friend's car. We just drove straight back to our house. Later that night, my uncle, dad, and cousin took his friend back to get his car, and it started up on the first try. When they drove past the house, everything looked completely normal, and there was a car in the driveway. To this day, we're not sure if the people living in that house saw us messing around in the graveyard and decided to prank the pranksters or if something else was going on. If it was a prank, they managed to pull it off incredibly quickly, and none of them ever admitted it. We felt too embarrassed to ask. I was 10 years old the first time I really faced death. I'd never lost someone close to me before, but every day, I interacted with the spirits of those who had been lost by others. It made me feel sad for these people, but at the same time, I couldn't help but be fascinated by it. These souls, who had passed on, were often closer to their loved ones than they had ever been in life, and yet they were still searching for peace. I didn't fully understand it, but I knew there was something bigger at play. I had always grown up around death and spirits. My mother, Mary, and my grandmother, Genevieve, were both mediums. They could sense things, see things, things I didn't fully comprehend as a child. My father, Tom, was a non-believer, so it was something that was mostly kept between the women in the family. As a young girl, I had never really questioned what I could sense. It was just part of life for me, like the way I could feel a presence before I saw it. But death, losing someone, was something I had never truly encountered until that October day. It started like any other normal day. The weather was cool, and the leaves were just beginning to change as fall set in. I had finished my homework and was looking forward to playing outside, when my mother suddenly mentioned that we were going to visit my grandmother. She and my sister had planned to go together. My father, who had grown up with my grandmother, had some business to attend to, and my uncle had just passed away. It was his funeral, and although I didn't know exactly what to expect, I knew I was about to experience something different. We arrived at the funeral home, and I felt a strange sense of unease as we walked in. My sister was busy talking to relatives, and I was left alone in the corner. My mind wandered as I stared at the coffin. For the first time, I realized that death was something real, something tangible. It wasn't just a part of the stories we'd heard before. It was something I would soon have to live with. There was something powerful about death that I didn't understand, but it made me feel deeply saddened and incredibly small. The funeral went on as expected, and I remember feeling strange, disconnected from everything happening around me. I spent most of the afternoon staring out the window, trying not to think about it, trying to avoid the creeping sense of panic. But it was hard to ignore the eerie silence. No one said anything about my grandfather's sudden passing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until a few days later that things truly began to change. I was alone in my bedroom, late at night, when I suddenly felt a strange presence in the room. The air grew thick and heavy, and a chill ran down my spine. My heart raced as I looked around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the unsettling silence. Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of the room, and I could hear soft footsteps approaching me from behind. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the room, but the room was empty. No one was there. But the feeling, the presence, was unmistakable. A voice called to me, a voice I recognized but couldn't place. And as the room grew darker, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The presence was real. I closed my eyes and prayed that whatever it was would go away. But when I opened them, the room was not as I had left it. The shadows had deepened, and the silence had become unbearable. I felt the pressure of someone behind me, their presence so real, so overwhelming. It felt like the room was closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, I woke up and found myself alone in my room. But as I went about my day, I realized that things had changed. My grandmother's house felt emptier, quieter. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung around me like a cloud. My mother and father went to work, and I was left alone to try and make sense of what had happened. It wasn't until later that day when my uncle came over that things started to make sense. He asked me what was wrong, noticing how pale and scared I looked. He listened patiently as I described what I had felt, the overwhelming presence in the room, and the strange sounds that had echoed in my mind. My uncle nodded, his face serious, and told me something that chilled me to the core. "Your grandfather passed away. But he's still here with us. And that's why you're feeling what you're feeling," he said quietly. In that moment, everything clicked. It wasn't just a dream or a figment of my imagination. My grandfather's presence was real, and he was trying to communicate with me. He had passed, but his spirit remained close, trying to offer comfort, and trying to make sure I knew he was still watching over me. I began to understand death in a different way, no longer just a dark, frightening concept, but a natural part of life, one that connects us to those who have gone before us. For the rest of the day, I spent time reflecting on what had happened. As I sat by the window, I thought about my grandfather's life, how he had been a strong, brave man, full of love and wisdom. I realized that his spirit would always be with me, even if I couldn't see him. And from that day on, the fear I once felt began to subside. I wasn't afraid of ghosts anymore. Instead, I learned to embrace the presence of those who had passed on, knowing that they weren't truly gone. They were just somewhere else, watching over us, waiting to share their love and wisdom when the time was right. This story happened when I was around 9 years old. It's not my first experience with the supernatural, nor my last, but it's the one that I feel compelled to share. I suspect that what happened was ghostly activity, though I can't say with absolute certainty. And even if it was a ghost, I still don't fully understand what that means. But I'd love to hear others' thoughts on it, whether they're mundane or supernatural. It was summer, and I still had a deep fear of being home alone. The fire from the previous year and the increased paranormal activity made me jumpy. My parents thought it was their responsibility to cure me of my fears, but things like this can't be cured. They either go away or become a normal part of life. My dad worked at Carter Lumber in both Madison and Austinburg, Ohio. The work he did was dangerous, involving machinery, large trucks, glues, and paints. Knowing the risks, my mother decided it was best for me to stay with her at the tea room where she worked, along with my sister, who had started waitressing there. I didn't mind working at the tea room. It felt almost like a family business. My mother was the cook and manager, my grandmother worked desserts and teas, and close family friends helped with waitressing and bussing. The owner, Michael Lopero, wife of City Councilman Vince Lopero, was sweet and paid me for doing odd jobs. For the most part, it was a peaceful environment. I was never alone and never in the dark. However, things started to change when Belinda, the dishwasher, began working fewer hours. Belinda was one of the smallest people I had ever seen, no more than 99 pounds. I don't remember all the details, but I remember that one day, I began to take her place in the dishroom. My mother showed me the ropes of washing dishes, how to grab the dirty plates, load the dishwasher, and put the clean ones away. It wasn't hard, just a little tedious. After my first load, my mother left me alone in the dishroom. The dishwasher hummed and roared as it worked, and I had little else to do but wait. I noticed the usual silence of the basement, where the dishroom was located. The old building had a certain eerie feel, but I'd grown used to it by now. I figured it was just a dark, old basement, nothing to be afraid of. But then, the atmosphere shifted. As I stood there, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I chalked it up to the cold, dim space, and the strange acoustics of an old building, but when I felt the familiar sensation of being watched, I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just a feeling, it was as if someone was right behind me, their presence so tangible that it almost made my skin crawl. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just an old building and I was overthinking it. But then I heard something. A quiet, soft noise from the other side of the dishroom, where the cold storage room was. I turned, expecting to see my mother, but no one was there. I thought maybe she had gone to the restroom or was busy in the kitchen, but I still felt the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice small and unsure. No answer. I took a deep breath and turned back to my work, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But just as I was about to resume, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking past the dishroom door and into the adjacent storage room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that it was my mother. I couldn't believe anyone else would be in the building. I called out again, "Mom?" But there was no answer. I hesitated for a moment, then ran to the door to check. When I stepped into the next room, it was empty. I sighed in relief, thinking it was nothing more than a trick of the mind. But when I turned to return to the dish room, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, moving in the corner of my eye. I looked again, and there, standing in the shadows, was a man. He was dressed in a dark brown coat and a matching hat. His face was mostly obscured by the brim of his hat, but his crooked smile was unmistakable. He stood motionless, hands in his pockets, and my blood ran cold. My heart raced, and I screamed. I dropped the tray of dishes, and everything crashed to the floor. I had never been so terrified in my life. The man didn't move, but he didn't need to. The sheer presence of him, his unspoken intent, had me paralyzed with fear. I curled into a ball on the floor, covering my head with my arms, unable to move or breathe properly. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually, my grandmother came to check on me. She found me in a fetal position, shaking with fear. When she asked what was wrong, I lied, telling her that I had a stomach pain. She comforted me and stayed with me for the rest of the day, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's smile. The next morning, my mother and I arrived early for work. She handed me a tray full of miscellaneous plates, glasses, and bowls that she wasn't sure she would need but wanted to be prepared. As I made my way down the basement stairs, I suddenly felt that all too familiar sensation, the feeling of eyes on me. My heart skipped a beat, and before I knew it, my eyes closed, almost as if they had a mind of their own. I took a deep breath and began to descend, focusing on the tray in my hands. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something strange. The man from the night before, the one with the crooked smile, was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I froze. My blood ran cold again as I locked eyes with him. My body felt heavy, my mind reeling, and before I could react, the dishes slipped from my hands and crashed to the floor. I screamed. My mother came rushing down to me, pulling me into her arms. She reassured me that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the terror of what I had just seen. Later, my mother told me something that made my skin crawl. She mentioned that she had heard stories of a man who used to work in the bank building that once stood in the same location. The man had been involved in a robbery years ago, and after a chase, he was shot and killed on the steps of the church across the street. She also mentioned that his spirit was known to linger around the old building. As my mom spoke, I realized that I had seen him, the man with the crooked smile. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he wasn't the first paranormal entity I had encountered. I had been in this building long enough to know that it was haunted, and this man, this ghost, was just another chapter in the strange history of that tea room. I don't work there anymore, and the building is long gone, replaced by something else. But the memories of what happened there stay with me. I'll never forget that crooked smile, and I'll never forget the chilling presence that haunted me that day. When I found out I was pregnant, I decided it was time to move in with my fiancé. I've always believed in ghosts, though I hadn't had any major experiences myself. My fiancé, on the other hand, was, or perhaps was, a non-believer. We got our first apartment in Fairfield, Ohio, on the 3rd floor. It was a bit of a challenge for me to manage the stairs as my belly grew bigger and bigger. I would often take pictures of my growing belly or of our pets, and sometimes I noticed a strange mist or orb in the photos. I'd hear little things at night, but always brushed them off as nothing. As my pregnancy progressed, though, things started to feel off. The atmosphere in our bedroom, especially, felt heavy, and it became harder to sleep. One night, I went to bed early while my fiancé stayed up until around 1 a.m. The next morning, he told me that he had heard a faint conversation in the living room. It was hard to make out, but it scared him so badly that it made his eyes water. I asked if maybe it was someone in the hallway, but he was certain it wasn't. Again, I shrugged it off. After our baby girl was born, things took a turn for the worse. The uncomfortable feelings seemed to follow us into her room. I found it unnerving to get up in the middle of the night and go to her room. Sometimes she would cry out, only to fall silent again moments later. I couldn't wait to move out of the apartment. Finally, the day came when we moved to a new apartment in Westchester, Ohio. This one was on the 1st floor, and I felt a sense of relief, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep again. But that was not to be. The first major encounter we had in the new apartment is the one that still gives me chills. I was in the bathroom, and as I walked out, I made my way through the hallway toward the living room. When I entered, I saw my fiancé sitting on the couch, his face bloodless. Immediately, he asked, "Did you go in the baby's room?" I told him I hadn't, and his mouth dropped open. He explained that while sitting on the couch, he was holding the baby monitor and heard a woman's voice on it, one that sounded devilish. He couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded like it was in a different language, and it terrified him. We didn't sleep that night, with the monitor running beside us. After that, Justin, my fiancé, started telling me about the shadows he was seeing and the noises he was hearing. It became the new normal. We both came to the conclusion that whatever had been in our last apartment had followed us. Near the end of our time in Westchester, I had the same experience with the baby monitor. That devilish woman's voice echoed through the apartment again, sending chills through my body for days. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep in our room without the TV on for some comfort. Eventually, we moved again, this time to our current place in Mason, Ohio. I had small hopes that whatever this was would leave us behind. We've been here for only a few months, but it's clear that whatever it is, it's still with us. The feeling in our room is overwhelming, and almost every night, something moves in the room. Objects will fall in the closet, or we hear paper or wrappers rustling, or I see something dark move out of the corner of my eye. It usually happens after Justin falls asleep, and I'm still awake. One night, the rustling of objects was so loud that Justin jumped up, grabbed his gun, and rushed to check on things. We always sleep with the fan pointed at us because Justin can't sleep without white noise. But the strange things, objects being moved or touched, always happen behind the fan, so we know it's not the fan causing it. One morning, I woke up around 6 a.m. and sleepily tried to turn the fan. I forgot that our toddler had taken the front off of it, and my finger got caught in the blades, leaving it bruised. That night, as I lay in bed while Justin was asleep, the fan moved, and I heard it hit something with a sound similar to when I got hurt. It felt like it was mocking me. My most recent experience happened just a few days ago. I was in bed when I heard a woman's voice whisper something right next to me. Justin, as usual, was fast asleep. It's strange to think that all of this started happening after I got pregnant. At first, we thought it might be Justin's grandmother. She passed away before we got pregnant, and Justin had been very close to her. But now, I'm not so sure. The voice we've heard doesn't sound like her, and I can't shake the feeling that this presence isn't friendly. If it is her, she's definitely not trying to protect us or offer comfort. I'm afraid to ask, as I don't know what might answer. This story takes place in a different house than the one I mentioned in my previous account. I live with my wife and our 3 kids, a 1-year-old daughter, a 6-year-old son, and a 7-year-old daughter, all of whom have had encounters with spirits. This particular story mainly focuses on my son, but there are some things related to the girls as well. It all started about 2 years ago. My son, who has quite an active imagination, came to us several times talking about a younger boy he kept seeing. As he described him, the boy was about his age and dressed in old-fashioned clothes. My wife and I, both of whom believe in the paranormal, initially chalked it up to his imagination. But as he continued to mention this boy, who would never tell him his name, we started to wonder if it might be something more than just a product of his imagination. One night, after I got home from work, I work late, usually getting home around midnight, my wife told me that she had seen a boy, about my son's age, standing beside her while she was doing the dishes. She said he was wearing clothes from the 50s. At first, I brushed it off as my son's talk of the boy getting her worked up. After we ate, we went to bed, and I didn't think much of it. The next morning, around 7:30 a.m., I came out of our bedroom and saw what I initially thought was my son. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't him. It was the boy my son had been talking about. As soon as I saw him, he disappeared, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a trick of the light. My son often talked about playing with this friend of his, saying they played with cars and Legos together, and he seemed to enjoy the boy's company. At that point, we had no reason to think anything was wrong, and things went on like normal for nearly a year. Then, about a year later, my youngest daughter was born. One night, when she started crying and needed a bottle, I got up to make it. As I was walking down the stairs, I heard something, but couldn't quite figure out what it was. After I made the bottle and was heading back upstairs, it hit me. I had heard what sounded like an older woman, maybe in her 70s, singing, "Hush, little baby." But as I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. When I entered the room, I casually mentioned, "That was really weird." To my surprise, my wife responded, "Was that the sound of the old woman singing or something?" I was unnerved, to say the least. It felt like there was a ghost watching over my newborn daughter. However, there were no further incidents, and we didn't think much more about it at the time. About 6 months later, my son started rearranging his room every night before bed. He would push his bed halfway across the room, right up to the closet door. This became really annoying, and my wife and I asked him why he kept doing it. His answer was, "There's a boy living in my closet, and I'm scared of him." We asked him if it was the same boy he had told us about before, but he said, "No, it's not him." 2 nights ago, I had a particularly unnerving experience. Around 2:30 a.m., I left my room to go downstairs. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I thought I saw my daughter standing there. I said, "Go to bed, it's not time to get up," but the figure just stood still. I squinted to get a better look, and to my shock, it wasn't my daughter, it was a girl, about 9 years old. She had black hair that fell just past her shoulders, and she was holding her right hand over the right side of her face, as though trying to hide. The side of her face I could see looked terrified. She looked up the stairs at me and then slowly raised her left hand, pointing over my shoulder. I won't lie, I ran downstairs as fast as I could. At least I knew what was in front of me, but I didn't want to turn around. When I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked back, the girl was gone. I didn't see anything, and the whole situation left me feeling uneasy. On top of that, pictures on the wall at the top of the stairs have been mysteriously knocked off, only to land about 20 feet down at the bottom of the stairs. This has happened multiple times, and it's as if something is deliberately moving them. I've started to reach out for advice on what's going on. We've been told that there are 5 spirits in the house, and one in particular is a concern. This one spirit has allegedly been following my wife since she was a child. That was before I even saw the little girl at the bottom of the stairs. It feels like things are escalating, and we're seeing more spirits and experiencing more paranormal activity. It's becoming harder to ignore. I've decided to try Rook's cleansing method, but so far, everything we've tried has only helped for a short time. I'd appreciate anyone's thoughts or advice on how to deal with this situation. I really just want peace in my home again, but it feels like whatever is here doesn't want to leave. A few weeks ago, my day had gone by as normally as possible. Nothing extraordinary, nothing unexplainable, just the usual routine of family life. We went to bed just after midnight, completely relaxed and in good spirits. If I recall correctly, I even fell asleep faster than usual, without the typical tossing and turning before finally drifting off. I can't even remember dreaming before I suddenly woke up. I'm not sure what exactly woke me. There were no strange noises, no extreme weather, or anything else that might normally stir someone from a sound sleep. But there I was, sitting upright in bed, as if I had just woken up from a horrible nightmare. I had this unsettling feeling, one I can't fully explain, as though something or someone had made me wake up at that exact moment for a reason. And then I saw it. Or rather, him. Right beside my bed, in the darkness, stood a dark shadow. I only saw him for a few moments, but even after that, I could still feel his presence standing there. I'm going to use the word him, though I can't exactly explain how I know it was a male presence. I just knew it, deep down. That's the best way I can put it. I was immediately overwhelmed with fear. It wasn't that I felt he meant me harm, but it was as though he was just standing there, intently watching me. And even though there was no clear interaction, the sensation of being watched was overpowering. You know that uncomfortable feeling of being stared at? Now imagine it magnified 1,000 times, because I wasn't just sensing it, I was seeing it, in the form of a shadow right beside me. I've read that energy feeds off of energy, that spirits or entities can feed on fear. I don't know much about the mechanics of it, but I know that I was terrified. I wasn't going to sit there in fear and let whatever this was linger any longer, so I gathered every ounce of strength I had and, in my sternest voice, I commanded, "You are not welcome here. You need to leave. Now. Go. Now!" As I spoke those words, I immediately felt stronger, like the fear was draining out of me. Slowly, the presence started to fade, and after a few minutes, I could no longer feel it. The oppressive energy beside me was gone, and I was left feeling calmer, though still shaken. I had a hard time falling back asleep that night, and ever since, I get that same uncomfortable feeling whenever I think back to what happened. But I remind myself to stay strong, to not let fear take hold, and the feeling fades away. Since that night, I haven't had another visit from the shadowy figure beside my bed. But this wasn't the first time I've experienced something like this. Over the years, I've had numerous encounters with shadowy figures or almost transparent misty forms, each one taking the shape of a full-bodied figure, but with no clearly defined features. The strange thing is, each time it happened, it occurred in a different location. For context, we built our house from the ground up, so I know for a fact that the home itself has no past history of hauntings. But these encounters, they've been happening for years, even before we moved here. And even though I only saw these shadow figures for brief moments, there were always strong emotions or strange feelings accompanying the experience. Like the time I felt the presence of the shadow beside me, even after I couldn't physically see him, I could still feel him there. I'm trying to make sense of all this. I've heard plenty of stories about people encountering apparitions, but do they usually come with these other sensations, like feeling a presence or an intense emotion? Why do I feel so sure, deep down, that the presence was male? Is there any way to explain that? And is there a difference between seeing a shadowy figure and an almost transparent mist figure? Lastly, I have to ask, is it possible that a person could be haunted, rather than a place? I've had multiple similar experiences, but they've all occurred in different locations, except for 2 of them. Most of them happened in places I've lived, both now and in the past. It makes me wonder if whatever this is has been following me around, rather than being tied to one specific location. My name is Lena, and for as long as my best friend Macy and I can remember, we've always experienced unexplainable things. We've seen and felt spirits, and the weirdest part is, it seems like the paranormal always revolves around us. It all started about 3 years ago, when Macy and I began hanging out more. That's when the strange occurrences began, and they've only gotten more frequent over time. One spring, Macy and I decided to go for a walk. We love walking and talking, especially when the weather's nice. I'd forgotten my shoes upstairs, so I ran up to grab them. Macy's house has a living room and kitchen that are connected, with stairs leading up right in the middle of the room. At the top of the stairs, there's a bathroom directly to the left, with a hallway leading to her sister's room on the right, Macy's room at the end of the short hall, and her mom's room at the other end, if you turn right at the top of the stairs instead of left. As I passed the bathroom on my way upstairs, I casually glanced inside. I'm a logical person, so I expected to see nothing. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Sitting in the corner, next to the bathtub, was a little girl. She was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest, her head resting on her knees. She was wearing a long, white nightgown, and had dark hair with bangs, about shoulder length. She was staring at me, waiting for me to notice her. I quickly grabbed my shoes, bolted for the stairs, and as I turned the corner to rush downstairs, I glanced back. The little girl was still sitting there, staring at me, in the same position. At that moment, I realized we were the only ones home. I was freaked out. As the months went by, we started seeing the little girl more and more. It wasn't just me, Macy started seeing her too. In fact, we seemed to be the only ones who ever saw her. It wasn't always in Macy's bathroom. We'd see her in different bathrooms, even at school. Once, Macy went into the school bathroom during third period, as she did every day. She was the only one in there, walking to the last, larger stall. As she passed the second stall, she heard giggling. Curious, she looked over and saw the same little girl standing with her face pressed against the crack in the door of the stall. Freaked out, Macy immediately left. The little girl would appear and then disappear for months at a time. Sometimes we wouldn't see her at all for weeks, then out of nowhere, she'd come back. She never seemed to be a threat, but she was always startling, especially when you weren't expecting her to appear out of nowhere. One day, my mom, who doesn't believe in spirits, went into the bathroom and screamed. I rushed in to find her shaken. She said there was a little girl with dark hair sitting on the toilet. At that point, Macy and I were relieved someone else had finally seen her too. Last winter, Macy and I were hanging out in her room, listening to music. She has an off-brand iPhone that plays music from her iPod, but it's kind of broken, so it needs a heavy weight on the cord to make it work. Normally, she uses it in the bathroom, so we'd left it there, turned up loud enough to hear it from her bedroom. We were the only ones home at the time. A Christmas song came on, one of those you always skip but never delete, so I went to change it. Macy decided to come with me, and as we walked halfway down the hall toward the bathroom, Macy suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs and pushed me forcefully into the bathroom. I slammed against the sink counter, and Macy quickly ran in, locking the door behind her. "What's wrong, Macy?" I asked, still trying to process what just happened. The terrified look on her face told me something was very wrong. She explained that she had seen a pitch-black figure running up the stairs toward us. I turned off the music, and we waited in silence. After a few seconds, we heard loud footsteps, as though someone was right outside the bathroom door. We weren't easily scared, but this was enough to keep us locked in the bathroom for an hour. Even after everything went quiet, we weren't brave enough to go back inside. We ended up sitting on the back porch, waiting for her mom and sister to get home. There was no way we were going back into that house alone. About 6 months ago, I started having a recurring dream. It always plays out the same way. I'm driving an old-fashioned car in the snow, with Macy sitting next to me in the passenger seat. But in the dream, it's not exactly her, it's her spirit, in a different body. In the back seat is another girl. I don't recognize her, but in the dream, I know she means something to me, just like Macy does. As we're driving down a dark road, surrounded by trees, I suddenly lose control of the car, and we swerve off to the right and into a pond. The car sinks quickly, and we unroll the passenger side window to push Macy out. I'm underwater, and she pulls herself out while I help push the girl in the back out. She gets stuck, and after what feels like forever, we finally get her out of the car. Then I crawl out myself. The next part of the dream isn't from my perspective anymore. It's from further away, almost like I'm watching a movie. On the opposite side of the pond, there's a sidewalk lined with trees. The moonlight shines through the bare branches, and I see all three of us walking side by side, barefoot and wearing long white gowns. It's snowing, and although I can feel the wind and see the cold in the air, it doesn't affect me. That's when I wake up. I've had this dream several times now, and after a while, I realize something. The girl in the back seat is the same girl Macy and I have been seeing all these years. Macy has also been having dreams, though not the same one. She's been dreaming of people drowning, and I've had other dreams where people die. It's all really strange. We've been dealing with this for years now, and we just want to understand why. Why is this happening? Why are we seeing these things, having these dreams? What does it all mean? This event took place during the time I lived in my old house in Akron, when I was 18 and 19 years old. The house was one of the oldest in the city, and we were allowed to stay there while we got on our feet. From the moment my friend Sarah and I moved in, we both knew something was off. I'm a strong believer in the idea that everyone has psychic abilities, and I was raised to believe that twins have a split soul and are more sensitive to spiritual energy. I'm a twin myself. I've always been interested in spirituality, and I had a sense that the house was harboring something that was waiting for us to notice. The house itself was very old, and much of the furniture in it was from when the previous owner's mother had lived there. It was a nice gesture, but the furniture still gave the place a chilling vibe, especially my room. My room had the most original pieces of furniture, and while I didn't think the furniture itself was directly tied to anything sinister, I did feel a constant unease. Sarah and I both noticed that the house always felt cold, even when we turned the heat up. The air at night had an almost alive quality to it, as if the house itself was charged with some kind of energy. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah and I slept in the same room, which had once been the mother's room. It was the only room that felt safe, though only when we were on the bed. I remember having recurring dreams about the house, but they were always centered around the dining area. I began to avoid the basement door as much as possible. It always felt like something was waiting on the other side. Curious, I decided to try and pick up on what was causing the unsettling energy, so I used my aura to try and feel or visualize any presence. It worked, almost immediately. I saw a tall figure in my mind's eye. It was shrouded in black wrappings, almost like ripped clothing, but there was nothing underneath. As soon as I focused on it, the atmosphere around me grew even heavier. It felt like the entity was aware of me looking at it, like it had noticed me trying to understand what it was. While I was out running errands or job hunting, Sarah would call me and talk. One time, she called me with a tone that sent a chill through me. She said, "Cole, I think I just saw myself." I was confused at first, but then she explained. "It was my silhouette but solid. It didn't attack me, but after I saw it, it darted toward the basement door like lightning." That sent my heart into my throat. I was still trying to understand spirits and entities at the time, but I knew what Sarah had seen wasn't a shadow person or a doppelganger. I told her that it was likely a manifestation of the negative energy in the house, both hers and mine. There was something more to it, something malevolent. I've always been into crystal divination, and I thought it might help to use the power of stones to protect the house. I placed quartz crystals in the corners of the master bedroom, where I spent most of my time. The crystals seemed to help a little. They made the room feel safer, but only as long as the door was closed. Outside of that, the house's energy felt unstable. One afternoon, Sarah was at work, and I decided to go downstairs to get lunch. When I walked into the kitchen, I froze. Every cabinet, the oven, fridge, and freezer, all of them were wide open. But it wasn't just the cabinets that were out of place. The food and dishes were scattered everywhere, completely unlike how we'd left it. Everything was pitch black, except for the fridge, which was empty. I can't even begin to explain how strange and terrifying that was. I ran upstairs, grabbed my phone, and called Sarah, telling her what I'd just seen. When she got home, we went down to the kitchen together, but it looked just as it had the night before. Everything was in its place. We were both shaken, but it was too much for Sarah, and she was beside herself with fear. I knew it was time to take action. I decided to do a crystal blessing of the house. I used a chunk of amethyst to calm the energy, and opal to bring insight into the situation. I went through each room, praying and charging the stones with my energy, releasing that energy to calm whatever was in the house. But when I got to the dining area, where the basement door stood, something changed. I couldn't muster any energy. The room felt like it was suffocating with dread. The energy there was thick, almost feral and angry, as if something was backed into a corner and was ready to strike. I was paralyzed by the fear it generated. Sarah suggested I go into the basement and try to confront whatever was there, but neither of us had ever dared to go into the basement. The fear of it was too much. When I tried to open the basement door, I couldn't get the handle to turn. It was freezing cold, and despite both of us tugging and pulling on it, the door wouldn't budge. After several minutes of trying, we gave up. We decided to go to bed together in the master bedroom for the night. I had been trying to give Sarah her privacy by staying in the second room, but that night, it felt safer to stay together. The next morning, we made our way downstairs to have breakfast and talk about our plans to move out. That's when we found it. A piece of old paper with what looked like black ink or paint scrawled on it. The message simply said, "Geh jetzt." It was in German, and it roughly translates to, "Go now." That was it. We packed our things and left the house immediately. We never went back. Even now, all these years later, I still feel that presence lingering in the back of my mind. It's as if it's still there, watching me, even though I'm on the other side of the country now. I'm not sure what it was or what it was tied to in that house, but I know one thing for certain. I will never set foot in that city alone again. This story takes place when I was 11 years old, and though it wasn't my personal experience with the paranormal, it became a turning point in my life. It started after my parents joined a new church, a group that seemed more like a cult than a congregation. At first, it seemed innocent enough. But soon, they began imposing odd rules on my parents, dictating what foods to eat, what shows to watch, and even what music they could listen to. My parents had always been deeply religious, but this new church seemed to go too far. For a long time, my dad had been a fan of the band Kiss, along with my mom, and when the church found out, they insisted that they couldn't keep any of the band's CDs, posters, or memorabilia in the house. One day, they came to our home and burned all of it, everything Kiss-related. It was then that my parents started to realize they had gotten themselves into something far more complicated than they anticipated. The church leaders told my parents that our house was unfit for my sister and me until they cleared it of the evil in its walls. So my parents sent us off to stay with my grandmother for the weekend while the church conducted what they called a spiritual cleansing of the house. My parents were told to keep my sister and me away for another day, though the church didn't explain why. This only made my parents more uneasy, but for some reason they listened. The story begins there. That evening, my mom and dad were sitting in the living room, talking about the strange people from the church. A long, narrow hallway separated the living room from the bedrooms where my sister and I slept. The house was quiet, and my parents were going through their usual evening routine, eating dinner and watching TV. My mom relays that, every so often, they would hear a voice from the darkness of the hall. It would speak, then fall silent, before repeating again in a whisper. My dad turned the TV down, trying to hear better, but there was nothing to be found. The voice came and went, growing fainter each time. Soon, my father went to bed, leaving my mom alone. As she sat there, writing in her diary, she suddenly saw a figure in the doorway. It looked like me. She heard my voice, just as it always sounded, asking, "What are you doing, Mom?" Without thinking, she replied, "I'm writing in my diary," still looking down at her notebook. But when she realized that neither my sister nor I were home, she froze. The figure was gone. My mom immediately called for my dad. When he came, she told him what happened, how the figure that looked like me had appeared in the doorway. As they talked, they heard something odd. The carpet began to shuffle in the hall. My dad stood up and looked at the floor, while my mom stayed seated on the couch behind him. Then, in the silence, my magic 8-ball, of all things, rolled through the door and stopped right at my father's feet. It was the same one my sister and I had used for years, a simple plastic toy we'd ask questions to. My mom, who was normally unshaken by anything supernatural, was now visibly frightened. She had always been accustomed to the paranormal, spirits, entities, things that went bump in the night, but this felt different. First, the figure in the doorway, and now this? She was scared. Something was moving things in their house. She had enough. My dad took the ball, tried to smash it with a hammer, but it wouldn't break. The next day, my parents took the magic 8-ball to the church, and the people there decided to bless it and then throw it into a fire. As far as they were concerned, that was the final step in cleansing our home. When my sister and I were allowed to return, I was still shaken by what had happened. I was eager to go back to my own room and put it all behind me, but when I opened my closet, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. There, on the top shelf, under my cat in the hat costume, was my magic 8-ball, the one that had been thrown in the fire. I had never seen it again after that night, and yet there it was, sitting in my closet as if nothing had happened. My heart raced. How could it have gotten there? When my mom walked in and saw it, she froze. She didn't say anything, but I could see the concern in her eyes. That night, I would have to sleep with the lights on. The oddness didn't stop there, though. Over the following weeks, the activity in our house grew worse. Objects would move on their own, strange noises would fill the house at night, and we would feel like we weren't alone, even when no one was around. Whatever the church had unleashed in our home had come back stronger, more malicious than before. A year later, we moved out of that house on Claymore Street. We never did get a full explanation of what had happened, but we were all relieved to leave. My parents eventually left the church, and we stayed away from anything related to that group. To this day, I'll never forget that strange magic 8-ball or the night it reappeared in my closet. Whatever it was that was unleashed in that house still lingers in my mind, and I've never been able to fully shake the feeling that something followed us out of that house. I was almost a teenager, and I could taste the freedom that was coming with it. I had waited my whole life for this moment. I was ready. Ready to be home alone. Ready to watch what I wanted, sing as loud as I wanted, eat what I wanted, and do it all without anyone telling me otherwise. My parents had plans that evening and wouldn't be back until the early morning, and my sister was out living her life. I had convinced them that I was ready to be home alone. The weather was clear, the house was well lit, and there was nothing to be afraid of, as long as I stayed away from the back rooms. My parents left, and I waved goodbye to them through the window. Once the door closed behind them, I was on my own. The beginning of the night went as planned. I watched TV and looked out the window every now and then, watching the sun slip behind the cotton candy-colored clouds. And then, it was dark, outside that is. Every light in the front of the house was on. I had made sure to gather everything I would need: blankets, pillows, stuffed animals, movies, and my music player. I was all set for the night, and no one was going to bother me. Since the church visit, the paranormal activity had worsened, but we had started getting used to it. When I heard voices in the back rooms, I turned up the TV. When I heard shuffling in the hall, I looked at the door and firmly told them to go away. My mother had stopped guiding me on how to deal with these things. She never told me what to do when I was scared. I had to figure it out on my own, and when I didn't have an answer, I learned the hard way. My mother never spoke about the paranormal anymore. She had her own experiences, and by the time I was old enough to understand, she'd given up. I had her blood, and my father's, running through my veins. What had been done to her couldn't necessarily be done to me. Yelling at the spirits seemed to work, scolding them when they tried to scare me. It wasn't easy, but I was getting better at it. As the shuffling in the hall grew louder, my heart began to race. I stood up and, with as much authority as I could muster, I yelled, "Go away!" To my relief, the sound stopped. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, before slowly walking to the threshold of the living room. It felt like hours before I finally gathered the courage to peek out into the hallway. The coast was clear. No one was there. I smiled to myself, feeling proud. I turned to head into the kitchen. It had been a while since I'd eaten, and it was time for a snack. Even though I was only 12, I could take care of myself. My mom was a professional cook, and I knew my way around the kitchen. As I stood by the window, preparing something to eat, I saw something move outside. My house was built with the kitchen window facing the backyard, which was enclosed by a large, tall fence. The fence kept the house hidden from view, and no one could get over it, not even the most skilled climbers. My family cherished their privacy, especially since the neighbors behind us were difficult people who had once nearly set our house on fire. My mother never trusted them, but we always kept a street light in the yard so the dogs had light at night. What I saw outside stopped me cold. A shadow blocked the light from the street lamp. But every time I looked, it vanished. I slowly walked to the window and peered out. The dogs were growling, staring at the window, completely ignoring me. And then I saw him. A man appeared, out of nowhere, standing at the base of the street lamp. He had a cigarette hanging from his lips, and his eyes, those eyes, pierced me to the core. He was tall, pale, and dressed all in black. His lower half faded into nothingness, like he was hovering. I knew exactly who he was. I didn't need to ask. He was David. The man outside was David, and I somehow knew him. His eyes, though they were kind, filled me with a sense of peace mixed with a slight unease. Then, just as I turned to look around the room, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there he was. David. He stood just inside the room, smiling at me with one hand in his pocket. His cigarette was gone. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart racing in a way I'd never felt before. I didn't know what it was, but there was something about him that felt safe. He wasn't here to hurt me. His eyes were warm, and I felt comforted, even though my stomach was in knots. "You will be fine," he said in a soft, gentle voice. His words calmed me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. And just like that, he vanished. The rest of the night passed in eerie silence. The usual activity in the house didn't return. My parents came home later, and I was half asleep when they arrived. I knew I would sleep soundly that night, knowing that David was looking out for me. The next morning, as I ate my cereal, I couldn't stop thinking about the man, David. I had his voice in my head, and his face wouldn't leave my mind. I asked my mom about him, but she didn't know anyone by that name. "Who is David?" I asked her, my voice filled with curiosity. "David?" she repeated. "I don't know anyone named David." I pressed further. "But I saw him, Mom. He was here last night. He looked just like someone I know. I saw his face, and I know his name." My mother stopped what she was doing and turned toward me. When I described David's clothes and features, my mother's face slowly changed. She froze for a moment before speaking. "David," she said softly, her voice full of disbelief. "That's impossible." It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. David had been a man who worked with my grandfather when my mother was born. He was supposed to help my grandfather on the day my mom was born, but his work had been interrupted by the birth. David had passed away in a car accident that same day, just hours before I was born. My grandfather had never mentioned David to me, but when I looked through old photos, I saw him clearly. He was the same man I had seen in my kitchen. He had come to me, a spirit protecting me in a way I couldn't fully understand. From that night onward, I no longer felt alone. David's presence stayed with me, always protecting me, always watching over me. I didn't fear the spirits anymore. I knew they weren't always there to hurt me. Sometimes, they were there to guide me, just as David had. I was almost a teenager, and I could taste the freedom that was coming with it. I had waited my whole life for this moment. I was ready. Ready to be home alone. Ready to watch what I wanted, sing as loud as I wanted, eat what I wanted, and do it all without anyone telling me otherwise. My parents had plans that evening and wouldn't be back until the early morning, and my sister was out living her life. I had convinced them that I was ready to be home alone. The weather was clear, the house was well lit, and there was nothing to be afraid of, as long as I stayed away from the back rooms. My parents left, and I waved goodbye to them through the window. Once the door closed behind them, I was on my own. The beginning of the night went as planned. I watched TV and looked out the window every now and then, watching the sun slip behind the cotton candy-colored clouds. And then, it was dark, outside that is. Every light in the front of the house was on. I had made sure to gather everything I would need: blankets, pillows, stuffed animals, movies, and my music player. I was all set for the night, and no one was going to bother me. Since the church visit, the paranormal activity had worsened, but we had started getting used to it. When I heard voices in the back rooms, I turned up the TV. When I heard shuffling in the hall, I looked at the door and firmly told them to go away. My mother had stopped guiding me on how to deal with these things. She never told me what to do when I was scared. I had to figure it out on my own, and when I didn't have an answer, I learned the hard way. My mother never spoke about the paranormal anymore. She had her own experiences, and by the time I was old enough to understand, she'd given up. I had her blood, and my father's, running through my veins. What had been done to her couldn't necessarily be done to me. Yelling at the spirits seemed to work, scolding them when they tried to scare me. It wasn't easy, but I was getting better at it. As the shuffling in the hall grew louder, my heart began to race. I stood up and, with as much authority as I could muster, I yelled, "Go away!" To my relief, the sound stopped. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, before slowly walking to the threshold of the living room. It felt like hours before I finally gathered the courage to peek out into the hallway. The coast was clear. No one was there. I smiled to myself, feeling proud. I turned to head into the kitchen. It had been a while since I'd eaten, and it was time for a snack. Even though I was only 12, I could take care of myself. My mom was a professional cook, and I knew my way around the kitchen. As I stood by the window, preparing something to eat, I saw something move outside. My house was built with the kitchen window facing the backyard, which was enclosed by a large, tall fence. The fence kept the house hidden from view, and no one could get over it, not even the most skilled climbers. My family cherished their privacy, especially since the neighbors behind us were difficult people who had once nearly set our house on fire. My mother never trusted them, but we always kept a street light in the yard so the dogs had light at night. What I saw outside stopped me cold. A shadow blocked the light from the street lamp. But every time I looked, it vanished. I slowly walked to the window and peered out. The dogs were growling, staring at the window, completely ignoring me. And then I saw him. A man appeared, out of nowhere, standing at the base of the street lamp. He had a cigarette hanging from his lips, and his eyes, those eyes, pierced me to the core. He was tall, pale, and dressed all in black. His lower half faded into nothingness, like he was hovering. I knew exactly who he was. I didn't need to ask. He was David. The man outside was David, and I somehow knew him. His eyes, though they were kind, filled me with a sense of peace mixed with a slight unease. Then, just as I turned to look around the room, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, and there he was. David. He stood just inside the room, smiling at me with one hand in his pocket. His cigarette was gone. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart racing in a way I'd never felt before. I didn't know what it was, but there was something about him that felt safe. He wasn't here to hurt me. His eyes were warm, and I felt comforted, even though my stomach was in knots. "You will be fine," he said in a soft, gentle voice. His words calmed me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. And just like that, he vanished. The rest of the night passed in eerie silence. The usual activity in the house didn't return. My parents came home later, and I was half asleep when they arrived. I knew I would sleep soundly that night, knowing that David was looking out for me. The next morning, as I ate my cereal, I couldn't stop thinking about the man, David. I had his voice in my head, and his face wouldn't leave my mind. I asked my mom about him, but she didn't know anyone by that name. "Who is David?" I asked her, my voice filled with curiosity. "David?" she repeated. I don't know anyone named David. I pressed further. But I saw him, Mom. He was here last night. He looked just like someone I know. I saw his face, and I know his name. My mother stopped what she was doing and turned toward me. When I described David's clothes and features, my mother's face slowly changed. She froze for a moment before speaking. David, she said softly, her voice full of disbelief. That's impossible. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. David had been a man who worked with my grandfather when my mother was born. He was supposed to help my grandfather on the day my mom was born, but his work had been interrupted by the birth. David had passed away in a car accident that same day, just hours before I was born. My grandfather had never mentioned David to me, but when I looked through old photos, I saw him clearly. He was the same man I had seen in my kitchen. He had come to me, a spirit protecting me in a way I couldn't fully understand. From that night onward, I no longer felt alone. David's presence stayed with me, always protecting me, always watching over me. I didn't fear the spirits anymore. I knew they weren't always there to hurt me. Sometimes, they were there to guide me, just as David had. In January of 2009, I was at my concert choir practice on a Saturday morning when I found out something that would change my life. I wasn't given many details, just told that I needed to go with my sister, who was waiting for me outside. When I arrived at home, I walked into a room full of people, faces full of grief, shock, and sorrow. It was then that I learned my childhood best friend, along with her parents, had been brutally murdered by their schizophrenic adopted son. The shock and pain of that event lingered, and we all grieved in our own ways. But it was my brother's fiancée who took it the hardest. These people weren't just family to her, they were her family. The girl was like her little sister, and the parents were as close to her as her own. The grief was overwhelming, and to this day, it still weighs heavily on her, affecting both her personal life and her work. The story I'm about to share starts on Sunday, March 11, 2012. I had spent the whole day at my brother's house, where my sister-in-law was finally feeling better. She had struggled with panic attacks for a week, but that day was the first in a while where she hadn't had one. She was happy, and it seemed like things were finally getting back to normal. Around 10 p.m., we went out to grab some groceries. When we came back, she handed me a few items and asked me to take them upstairs and put them in her room. I grabbed the items from her and made my way up the dark staircase, flipping on the light as I entered her room. As I walked across the room to place the items on the bed, something caught my eye. The dream catcher I had bought her for Christmas was spinning above me. It was attached to the ceiling fan, which was turned off, and the windows were closed, meaning there was no draft. I thought it was strange but shrugged it off. As I turned to leave the room, I glanced in the mirror that was opposite the door. That's when I saw them. In my reflection, standing behind me, were my sister-in-law's parents, their hands resting on my shoulders. But their faces weren't the way I remembered them. They looked down at me, but their faces were horribly disfigured, bloody, with holes all over them, which I assumed symbolized how they had died. The sight took my breath away, and I immediately ran down the stairs without looking back. When I reached the bottom, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I didn't want to worry my sister-in-law, so I said nothing. The rest of the night was spent on edge. I waited anxiously for my mother to arrive so I could go home. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, but I didn't want to say anything that might upset my sister-in-law further. I had seen the pain she was already going through, and I knew she wasn't ready to hear about this. So I stayed quiet. As I paced back and forth between the kitchen and the front door, peeking outside to see if my mother had arrived, something made me stop. For the third or fourth time, I turned to check the door, and that's when I saw her. My childhood friend. The girl who was like a sister to me. The girl who had been lost so tragically. She was slowly walking down the stairs, her expression fixed on me. I saw that familiar smile, the one I used to adore, but now her face was just like her parents', covered in blood, with holes all over. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I walked into the kitchen, trying to avoid any confrontation, trying not to let the fear show on my face. I needed to hide my emotions to protect my sister-in-law from even more pain. I don't know why they showed themselves to me that night, but I have a couple of ideas. First, I think they showed themselves to me because they wanted me to talk to my sister-in-law. She's been carrying this grief for so long, crying every day, not able to let go. I understand how hard it must be for her, but I think her loved ones want to help her move on. They want to leave her, but they can't, not as long as she's holding on to the past. The second possibility is that the appearance was a result of something more scientific. Maybe the dream catcher triggered a memory in my brain, bringing all of this to the surface and creating an image of what I was subconsciously thinking about. I don't really know how it works, but it's a guess. The truth is, I'm not sure what happened that night, but it still haunts me. I don't think it was a dream. I know it wasn't. What I saw was real. And I can't shake the feeling that my sister-in-law's family came to me to help her. They wanted her to let go so they could find peace. I've since recovered from the loss. I grieved for them, but over time, I learned to accept their passing and trust that they were in a better place. But that night I couldn't help but wonder, if they were in a better place, why did they come back? Were they stuck? Were they trying to reach her? Or were they just here to make sure she would finally let go? Whatever the case, that experience made me realize how much unresolved grief can hold on to us, and how sometimes the spirits of those we love are waiting to help us heal, if we're ready to let them go. It was a typical Friday morning in September when I sent my daughter, Jerica, a quick text to make sure she was up for work. She replied saying she was, but then added something that caught my attention. "Mom, something scared me last night when I got home." Naturally, I walked away from my desk and called her right away, asking her what she meant. Jerica explained that when she got home the night before, around 1:30 a.m., she felt uneasy. I immediately asked how the dogs reacted, thinking maybe someone had been in the backyard. We had 2 full-grown Australian shepherds at the time. She said the dogs were fine, but as she looked at her bedroom window, she got scared. I asked her why she didn't call me on her cell phone and tell me she was scared so I could come to the door. "I didn't think about it, Mom," she said. My reaction? "Are you serious?" Now, a little background might be helpful here. Jerica had a friend I didn't particularly like. This friend was deeply depressed, didn't take her medication, and often tried to isolate Jerica from other people. A few months before this incident, when Jerica came home from this friend's house, I saw something that completely freaked me out. As Jerica walked through the door, I saw a shadow attached to her, like a mist following her. Jerica is an empath, and when she's around this friend, her whole demeanor changes. She doesn't have to tell me when she's been with her. I can feel it the moment she walks in the door. But that day I saw it. It was like a dark shadow hovering around her. So, when Jerica told me she felt like there was someone watching her in her bedroom that night, my first thought was that it might be our ghost man, the one I've mentioned in my other story, My Ghost Who Cussed. But then, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that all this negative energy Jerica brought home with her after seeing her friend might be lingering in her room. Jerica's room was dark. She kept the blinds and curtains closed all the time, and the door was always shut. It felt like the perfect breeding ground for negativity. Our ghost man wasn't malicious. I'd heard his voice many times on my DVR, and each time, his voice sounded kind and calm. But that night, I started to wonder if maybe there was something more to the situation. What if the negativity from Jerica's friend had made things worse? What if that was why Jerica felt so scared? I told Jerica that if we didn't get the negativity out of the house, we might end up with a poltergeist on our hands. I knew that was something I had to avoid. So, that afternoon, I went to a shop owned by some friends and explained the situation. I walked out with some essential oils for Jerica to wear, protection candles, sweetgrass, sage, and sandalwood incense. When I got home, I opened Jerica's windows to let the fresh air in, set up the DVR to record, lit the protection candle, and began smudging her room. As I swept the room, I demanded that any and all negative entities leave. I told them they weren't welcome anymore. Afterward, I smudged Jerica herself, hoping that would help clear the air. While I was smudging the room, I spoke aloud, saying, "If you didn't mean to scare Jerica, that's one thing. I still believed that maybe she had just scared herself." But when I listened to the DVR recording, I heard our ghost man's voice responding to me. It sounded like he said, "Roger," which I took as an agreement, like he was acknowledging what I said. Almost as if to say, "Okay." The next day, I asked Jerica how she felt after the smudging. She said she felt really good, and I could see the difference in her. She looked brighter, almost like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. We had a long talk about her room, and I explained that I didn't think there was anything evil in it, but that maybe the combination of watching a scary movie and being around her friend had just made her scared. She seemed to understand, and I felt more at ease. There were a few things that made me think it wasn't anything evil in her room. One was our cat, Rex. We always call him the demon cat from hell, because he's very particular about where he goes and who he interacts with. If there was anything negative in Jerica's room, Rex would have acted up. But he wasn't. He was fine, and that told me everything I needed to know. Also, when I sat in Jerica's room before I began smudging, I didn't feel anything negative at all. There was no bad energy. And when I listened to the DVR recording, the only voice I heard was our ghost man's, and it sounded just like it always had, calm, matter-of-fact, and without any malice. A few days later, I began to wonder if the events of that night were connected to something else that had happened earlier. That Thursday night, my young son Dalton had asked me whether I thought the ghosts had gone away. I told him that I didn't think they were gone, but the noise from the AC might be drowning them out. Then, out of nowhere, Dalton said, "Okay, ghosts, you can come out. We're not afraid. You can talk to us." He said it as if it was completely natural, like he was talking to an old friend. Later that night, when Jerica came home, she felt the presence of someone watching her. I thought it was strange that our ghost man had appeared in her room for the first time since then. Dalton had opened the door for him. A week later, while Dalton and I were in the kitchen, Dalton told me, "Mom, I saw him. I saw him coming out of Jerica's room." I asked him not to tell Jerica about it, knowing it might freak her out. Dalton looked at me, concerned, and said, "Do you think it'll scare her?" I smiled, feeling a little lighter, and said, "Yeah, I think it might." My name is Jofranka Daly, and I'm married to Jurg, a man from Russia who moved to the United States at 17 with dreams of joining the army. He later decided to become an accountant. I was born in Germany, and my parents moved here a week before I was born. We now live in Ohio, in a tight-knit community with a rich mix of European backgrounds. Life has always been relatively peaceful, and I consider myself a small-town girl, so I found this new place to be incredibly welcoming. I have 5 wonderful children: Luminitsa, 15, Sergey, 14, Orva, 13, Burian, 6, and Odile, 4. Life was good until one day in January 2009 when everything changed. It was a Saturday morning, and I was at concert choir practice when I received news that shook me to my core. I didn't get the details at first, but I was told to leave and go with my sister. When I arrived home, I was met with a room full of grief-stricken faces. I learned that my childhood best friend, along with her parents, had been brutally murdered by their schizophrenic adopted son. It was devastating. The grief affected us all, but it hit my brother's fiancée the hardest. These people were her family, her little sister, her parents. It tore her apart, and she still carries that sorrow with her. It's affected both her professional and personal life. But it was just the beginning of what would become a long road of strange experiences for me. Fast forward to Sunday, March 11th, 2012. I had spent the day at my brother's house. My sister-in-law was in high spirits, for the first time in a week without a panic attack. We went out for groceries around 10 p.m., and when we returned, she handed me some items and asked me to take them upstairs to her room. As I walked up the dark staircase, I turned on the light in her room, placed the items on her bed, and that's when I noticed something odd. The dream catcher I had bought her for Christmas was spinning in midair above me, attached to the ceiling fan, which was turned off. The windows were closed, and there was no draft in the room. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. I was about to leave the room when I glanced at the mirror opposite the door. That's when I saw them. In the reflection, standing behind me, were my sister-in-law's parents, their hands resting gently on my shoulders. But their faces weren't right. They looked distorted, covered in blood, and with holes all over them, the way they had died. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned and ran downstairs, not daring to look back. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the fear still gnawed at me. I didn't want to tell my sister-in-law what I saw, but I couldn't shake it off. The rest of the night passed in a state of unease. I waited anxiously for my mother to come and take me home. I paced back and forth, glancing out the door every few minutes to see if she had arrived. It was the third or fourth time I turned around when I saw her. My childhood friend, the girl who was like a sister to me, slowly descended the stairs, her expression fixed on me. She had that same smile I used to adore, but her face was bloody, just like her parents. I could feel my heart racing as I watched her. I didn't want to look anymore, but I couldn't help it. I quickly walked into the kitchen and tried to hide my fear, hoping my sister-in-law wouldn't notice anything was wrong. I don't know why they showed themselves to me that night. I have a couple of ideas though. First, I think they showed themselves because they wanted me to talk to my sister-in-law. She has been carrying the weight of her loss for so long, holding on to her grief, and I believe her loved ones wanted to help her move on. They didn't want to stay with her in her pain, but she's unwilling to let go. They want her to heal, but they can't leave until she's ready. The second idea is more logical, or at least, I hope it is. I wondered if the dream catcher had triggered a memory in my subconscious. Perhaps it brought up feelings I had buried, and my mind created the image of my sister-in-law's parents. I don't really know how that works, but it's something I've considered. Either way, I don't think it was a dream. I know what I saw, and it was real. I don't understand why they came to me, but the experience still haunts me. I've tried to make sense of it, but sometimes I wonder if there's something about me that makes these spirits seek me out. Maybe they knew I would be able to understand them, to see them, when no one else could. Sterling Macmillan Manor was an apartment complex that felt more like a dormitory for college students, except it was more than twice the cost. Located on E. Macmillan Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, it was just a stone's throw away from the University of Cincinnati main campus. I lived there during my freshman year of college, until the end of May. At first, the strange happenings were small and innocent, and I didn't think much of them. Every so often, I'd notice sparkles appearing out of nowhere, mostly in the bathroom, or the living room/kitchen area. They started as tiny collections of light, and would slowly spread across the room. I knew it wasn't the lighting, it only ever happened in these two rooms. It never happened in my bedroom, where I spent most of my time on the computer. I'd been using my computer before moving into the apartment and afterward, but I never saw those sparkles anywhere else. These occurrences began just before Christmas break. When the break came, my roommates left for the month, returning to their homes for the holiday. I stayed behind, partly because I wasn't on good terms with my mom at the time. The apartment building was practically empty, with only a few students remaining. The silence was almost comforting, until I started hearing things. It began with the sound of doors opening and closing. At first, I thought it was my roommates, but I quickly realized they weren't home. The sounds, footsteps, doors creaking, the front door opening and closing, were coming from the hallway right outside my door, not from above or below me. There was no one else on my floor. It felt strange, eerie, and unsettling, especially knowing I was alone. Then there was the issue with the dishwasher. After my roommates returned, we noticed it wasn't working properly. Maintenance came to check it out, and we discovered that the dishwasher's knob had somehow been turned completely around. So when we thought we were starting it, it was actually on the dry cycle. No one had touched it, and we couldn't explain how it had happened. Over the course of the next month, we also needed to replace light bulbs more often than usual. They were fluorescent bulbs, and they seemed to burn out at an alarming rate. I thought it was just a coincidence at first, but it became hard to ignore. At the time, these incidents seemed small, almost trivial. Nothing that I couldn't explain away, and I never felt truly threatened. I tend to be a live and let live kind of person. If something wasn't harming me, I didn't feel the need to confront it. But by the end of the year, things changed. When my roommates moved out, one to a new apartment in the building, another to live with her boyfriend, and the third because she graduated and had to leave the student housing, I was left alone in the apartment. I theorized that maybe the spirit had been trying to get my attention all along in small ways, but I hadn't listened. Now, with no one else around, it seemed like the spirit was ready to make its move. One night, while I was struggling to sleep, I saw something I couldn't explain. A white figure, in the shape of a woman, suddenly appeared above my bed. She flew down toward me with terrifying speed. At first, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming, but I hadn't been dozing off. I'd been wide awake, staring at the ceiling. And when I think back, I know it really happened. I didn't react, maybe because I was too confused to be scared. The figure disappeared as quickly as it came, and I didn't see it again. Perhaps it was waiting for me to respond, but since I didn't, it left. A week later, I moved rooms to get away from the heat of the summer. That night, I got up to go to the bathroom, but as I stepped out of bed, my legs suddenly gave out beneath me. I collapsed and landed awkwardly on my thumb, breaking it. I've always been clumsy, but I wasn't tired enough to just fall for no reason. It felt like something had made me trip, like it was pushing me, and I couldn't explain it. By this time, I was being evicted. Work had cut my hours significantly, and I couldn't afford rent anymore, so I was already planning to leave. Maybe that's why the spirit acted out when it did. Perhaps it wanted something from me. Maybe it realized that it was running out of time. I had ignored it for so long, and now, at the last moment, it made its presence known. I don't blame it for my injury. In a way, it felt like a final, desperate attempt to get my attention. I couldn't help but wonder what it needed or wanted. I just wished I had been able to listen before. The apartment was full of strange incidents that I now believe were caused by something, or someone, trying to make contact. But I never found out what it wanted. I left, and life moved on, but I still think about what happened there, and I sometimes wonder if I was the one who failed that spirit by not paying attention. Maybe if I had listened earlier, things could have been different. On October 18, 2008, my grandsons Blake and Dalton stayed the night at my house. The next morning, before they left, Blake asked if he could clean Dalton's room on his own. Normally, the rule was that all three of them had to clean the room together before leaving, but Blake insisted, so I let him. He did a really great job, and of course, I praised him for it. That night, Dalton came to me upset because he couldn't find his favorite toy, Buzz. I told him to check his room, but Dalton said he already had. So, I went to look for it myself. I checked everywhere in Dalton's room, looked through all his plastic baskets, dumped them out, but there was no Buzz. Dalton has 2 baskets, one for soft toys and the other for hard plastic ones. I'm a little obsessive about keeping things organized, so I know where everything goes. But since Blake had cleaned the room, the toys might not have been put back in the right places. I couldn't find Buzz anywhere. I looked under the bed, in the closet, even in the dresser drawers, but still no Buzz. I checked the living room, moved furniture, and looked all over, even in my bedroom. But no Buzz. Dalton was really upset and cried that night because Buzz was lost. It felt like we were living out a scene from Toy Story. I promised Dalton that we would look again the next day. I even called Blake to ask if he remembered where he had put Buzz, but Blake didn't even know what Buzz looked like. I thought, "Are you serious?" I even checked my truck, even though I knew Buzz wasn't out there since we hadn't left the house. But I had to check. The next night, I searched again, same routine, checking Dalton's room, dumping baskets, looking under the bed, and even checking my bedroom. Still no Buzz. Dalton cried again. He asked if I could buy him a new Buzz, but when I looked online, I couldn't find one that looked like the original. Then, 6 days later, on Friday morning, as we were getting ready for school, Dalton came out of his room with his hands behind his back and asked me to guess what he had. I guessed a few things. A kangaroo? Nope. A truck? Nope. An ostrich? Nope. Then Dalton pulled Buzz out from behind his back. I couldn't believe it. Dalton was so happy, and so was I. I asked him where he had found Buzz, and he said, "On top of my basket." I was happy, but also really confused. I had searched Dalton's room 3 times already, and Buzz wasn't there. I asked my daughter Jerica if she had found it, and put it there as a surprise, but she said no. Dalton hadn't had time to search for Buzz, he just came out of his room with it in his hand. That evening, I asked Dalton to show me which basket Buzz had been in. Even though I knew it was impossible, I was shocked when Dalton showed me the small basket for soft toys. This was the first basket I had checked, and I had dumped it out 3 times. There was no way Buzz could have been overlooked. At the time, I didn't realize it was Mary who had found Buzz. 2 months later, we learned that Mary had passed away in the house. After we found out about her, and began interacting with her more, I had Dalton thank her for finding Buzz. I'm sure it was Mary who put Buzz back in the basket for Dalton to find. A few weeks ago, I received a call from my youngest stepdaughter. "I think there's something here," she said. "Can you come over one night and see if you can find anything?" She explained that for the last few months, she'd been dealing with strange and intolerable odors, awful bathroom smells that seemed to come out of nowhere. But it wasn't just that. She said her son, Andy, was terrified of his bedroom. "He won't even go in there to play anymore," she told me. I agreed to come over the next night after my class to see what was going on. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "You're the only one who can help me." Andy had been screaming whenever he got near his bedroom doorway, calling it the scary. He kept saying that the scary was in there. Now, I was really concerned. That night, I gathered my thoughts as I wondered what could be going on, and whether I'd be able to help my 4-year-old grandson. Part of me wondered if he was simply having trouble adjusting to his new baby brother. But another part of me was starting to think there was something more to it, something he was truly scared of. When I arrived the next evening, I spoke to my stepdaughter, who told me that Andy's fear had gotten worse. At first, he'd slept and played in his room like any other kid, but suddenly, he wouldn't even go in there. I asked if the baby had been sleeping in the room with her, thinking maybe sibling jealousy could be at play, but that wasn't the case. The baby had his own room, so it wasn't about that. I followed Andy upstairs to his room, where I turned on my DVR to record, just in case I needed proof of what was happening. Andy showed me where the scary was, right up on the top shelf of his closet. I looked, but I couldn't see anything. He asked, "Can't you see it, Mimi?" I hated to disappoint him, but I had to explain that sometimes adults don't see the things little kids do. I assured him that if he saw the scary, we could make it go away. I wanted to empower him, make him feel like he had control over what was happening, so I decided to let him help me. I lit my smudge stick, and together we smudged the room. I had him repeat after me, saying things like, "You need to leave. I'm not afraid of you anymore. You don't belong here. I'm a big boy. Go away. You don't scare me. Leave and never come back." As we moved through the room, we directed the scary toward the window and out through a small hole in the screen, telling it to leave and never come back. When we finished, Andy seemed proud of himself. He asked if we could do it again, this time with his mommy. So, we went downstairs and got my stepdaughter, and we went through the process again. Andy repeated his words, telling the scary to leave. We made sure the spirit was gone, but after we finished, Andy asked me, "How long? How long before my bad thing disappears?" I was caught off guard. "What do you mean, how long?" I thought it was over, but he seemed certain it was still there. "Are you sure?" I asked him, and he pointed to the top of his closet, where the scary had been. "Okay. Time for a new approach." "How long do you want it to take?" I asked. "One," he replied. 1 minute. I smiled a little, trying to ease the tension. "All right, close your eyes, and you have to believe it's gone. Do you believe?" I asked. He hesitated. "I can't," he said. So I explained that if he believed it was still there, then it would still be there. But if he truly believed it was gone, then it would be gone. We spent a few minutes talking and joking about how strongly he believed, and soon enough, Andy said he was ready. "Okay, open your eyes," I told him. "Let's see if you really, really believe it's gone." When Andy opened his eyes, his face lit up. "It's gone, Mommy," he said, looking at his mom with relief. My stepdaughter and I exchanged glances, a mix of relief and disbelief. But when we went to the closet to check, Andy said it was really gone. I was cautiously relieved. The room felt lighter. Andy had done it. He believed it was gone, and it was gone. I left the smudge stick with my stepdaughter, explaining that it was important for her to be able to do this herself, just in case. The next day, when I checked on Andy, my stepdaughter said he told her that the scary was still gone. He even played in his room without any fear. It's been over a month since then, and Andy has had no further issues with his room. He's been able to play and sleep in there without fear. So, what really happened? Was it a figment of Andy's imagination, or was there something truly paranormal going on? I don't know for sure. What I do know is that whatever it was, Andy believed in his own power to make it go away, and that belief gave him the strength to conquer his fear. Whether it was a ghost or just a manifestation of fear, I'm just glad that it's gone, and that Andy is back to feeling safe in his own room. And for me, the fact that it worked makes me feel better too. I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat if it meant helping him. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. On the afternoon of October 13, 2007, I made what I thought at the time was a big traffic mistake. Where I'm from, we have what's called swap days, also known as trader days. For those who aren't familiar, it's an event that can completely tie up traffic for hours in every direction. And I mean hours. So, I usually try to avoid it at all costs. To avoid sitting in traffic forever, I decided to cut through a part of town I didn't usually go through. It wasn't that there was any reason to avoid this area. It was just a residential neighborhood, and I didn't know anyone who lived there. So, there was no real reason for me to be there. As I was driving down the street, I noticed a single swing on a swing set moving. At first, I thought a child had jumped out, so I slowed down. But as I got closer to the yard, I realized the swing was still swinging at the same steady pace, with no one in it. I didn't feel any wind, but I thought maybe a breeze had started it. However, the other swing and the teeter-totter were completely still. I thought maybe a child had been swinging and just jumped out, and I couldn't see them. So, I stopped before I reached the yard and looked around for any children. There were none. The yard was completely empty. Then I looked back at the swing. It was still moving smoothly, not slowing down at all, and not moving in a jerky way like it would if someone had jumped out. I couldn't explain it. That's when something else caught my eye. Two little girls, about my son's age, he was 6 at the time, were standing at the living room window, staring at the swing. At first, you might think there's nothing unusual about two girls watching a child swing. But the strange thing was, their eyes were wide open, and their mouths were hanging in a surprised, "oh" shape. It made me think they were seeing something I wasn't. Maybe the child swinging in the empty swing, while all I could see was the swing moving. There was nothing else in the yard. It was completely desolate, not even an animal in sight. Just me and that swing. The girls were still staring, and when the older one saw me looking at them, she glanced between me and the swing. I smiled and nodded at her. She looked back at the swing, her face still wide-eyed, but she wasn't scared, just surprised, like, "Wow, there's someone swinging in our swing!" I'm not sure if they fully realized what they were seeing, but from the way they looked, I think they had an idea. As I turned the corner, the house was on my right. I slowed down almost to a stop and looked again. The swing was still moving exactly the same, still smooth and steady, not slowing at all. I really wish I'd had my camera with me to record it. It was an experience I'll never forget, one of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen. I only wish I had been lucky enough to see the child swinging peacefully in that swing. I thought I might be able to prove that it was a residual haunting. But unfortunately, the family who lived there moved away, taking the swing set with them. If there's a family living in the house now, I haven't seen any signs of children. Maybe one day another family will move in and set up a swing set again. I still drive by every now and then, just to see if anything has changed. If I hadn't forgotten that it was Swap Days weekend, I would have never taken that detour and would have missed out on this amazing experience. When I was about 7 years old, something happened that I've never been able to fully explain. It was in Akron, Ohio. My parents, 2 brothers, and I had gone there because we got a call from my aunt. She told my father that my grandmother was in the hospital and in critical condition. My grandmother, a diabetic with heart problems, had fallen asleep on the couch, and when my grandfather tried to wake her, she couldn't be roused. That's how it all started. After several days of waiting, with doctors doing everything they could, they finally gave up. They unplugged my grandmother from the machines. She never woke up. We all felt terrible for my grandfather, who had just lost the love of his life, the woman he had been with since he was 16. We decided to stay at his house for a few days to help him through the mourning process and to attend my grandmother's funeral. The funeral took place 4 days after my grandmother's death. Although we were all grieving, we tried to keep the atmosphere as normal as possible. The adults were talking and sharing stories in the living room, and I, being just a first grader, grew bored. I didn't want to see the tears or hear the sorrow, so I decided to leave the room. I ran into the spare bedroom that my family always stayed in when we visited. There, against the wall, was the mattress where I used to play as a child. I would crawl behind it and pretend it was my own little house. But after a while, I grew bored of my game and decided to head back to the living room. As I peeked my head out from behind the mattress, ready to walk out the door, I saw something that made my heart stop. A transparent, white mass was slowly entering the room, moving towards me. I was so scared that I immediately ducked back behind the mattress. My first thought was that it must have been my imagination, but when I peeked out again, I saw that it was still there. The figure was in the shape of a human, though it was indistinct, just a glowing form with legs, walking toward me. I moved to the other side of the mattress, but I was only getting closer to it. My heart was pounding. I knew I had to get away, so I gathered up all my courage and ran straight for the door, dodging the figure as I turned the corner to go into the hallway. That's when I heard something that froze me in my tracks. My grandmother's voice, softly calling my nickname. "Sissy." It sounded like a whisper, gentle and comforting, but it came from behind me. I was so terrified by the apparition that I didn't stop running until I reached the living room. I rushed in, breathless, and tried to tell my mom what had happened, but she didn't take me seriously. She told me she wasn't in the mood for jokes. I didn't speak about it to anyone else for years. When I finally told my brother about the experience years later, he didn't believe me. He thought I had just read too many ghost stories and made it up. But my father, he believed me. He's the kind of person who knows when I'm lying, and he could tell I wasn't. He even shared his own experiences with me, which made me feel a little less crazy. To this day, I wonder what it was that I saw and heard that day. My theory is that it was my grandmother visiting me again. Maybe she saw me playing and, just like she would have done in life, wanted to join in on the fun. The voice I heard, her calling me back, could have been her way of comforting me, sensing that she had startled me and wanted to make sure I was okay. I'll never know for sure. I'm sharing this story because I've been fascinated by the paranormal for as long as I can remember. I've always wondered if there's something more out there, something beyond what we can explain. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. What do you think? Was it my grandmother, or is there another explanation for what happened that day? When I was 11 years old, my family moved into an old house in the countryside of Akron, Ohio. It was about 30 years old, but even from the start, something didn't feel right. I was often home alone because my parents were working and my sister was at volleyball practice. And though I was alone, I never felt like I was. It was as though something, or someone, was always watching me. The experiences I had in that house started small but soon escalated. I often woke up with unexplained scratches on my arms. One time, I had a deep gash on my stomach and another on my leg, scars that I still carry today. I'd frequently notice things brushing past me, and at night, I'd see a shadow-like figure crawling up the walls and across the ceiling, peeking from behind furniture, always watching me. Sometimes, I'd sit on my bed and watch him charge toward me, only to disappear before reaching me. I called him the Shadow, and I wrote about him in my journal often. One night, just before I turned 13, I had what I still consider my worst experience in that house. It was around 3 a.m., and I couldn't sleep because the heat was unbearable. I decided to relax in the living room with my journal and listen to some music. I'd just finished writing about my day when suddenly the radio turned on by itself. I froze. It was so terrifying that I started writing in my journal as things began to happen, documenting every moment. Here's what I wrote. Asterisk. Today, I was listening to my MP3 player while reading my book. Then the radio turned on by itself. It was really scary. Oh crap. I think I just saw something. It's in the corner of the wall by the closet. I'm going to see what it is. Hold on a sec. Whatever it is, it's in the closet. I hear something too. It's like a cricket, only continuous. And the sound disappears when I turn my head. I'm really scared. I wish someone else was here. It stopped. The door just creaked. God, I thought this was going to stop happening to me. I'm really scared, I can't say that enough. OMG, something's outside the door. I just saw it. WTF. I'm going to my room. Okay, I'm in here, and I turn the lights on. They're flickering, but they always do that, the light bulbs are old. Everything seems much calmer now. I think I'm going to bed. P.S. The couch was moving too. P.P.S. OMG. The shadow is in my doorway. Asterisk. The cricket sound I was hearing seemed to mix with a low fizzing noise, almost like a growl. I could see orbs of light landing on the couch near me, right when I noticed the figure in the corner of the closet. It looked like a dress shirt with a tie, but that was all I could make out before it disappeared. When I got up to check the closet, I saw that the door was slightly open. I tried to open it, but the air around it was ice cold, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I quickly shut the door. But when I turned back to the couch, I saw something so terrifying that I'll never forget it. The front door creaked open. I glanced over, and in the glass, I saw a pale face with hollow, black eye sockets and an open mouth, just pure darkness inside. Its hands were pressed against the glass, and it was staring at me. At the same time, the couch I was sitting on started shaking. I ran to my room, locked the door, and started writing in my journal again. I said I was in my room, hoping that somehow, that would make it stop. But then, as I looked up, I saw the shadow standing in my doorway. I had never seen it that close, not standing upright like that. I grabbed my Bible and read Psalm 91 aloud, twice. When I finished, I looked up, and it was gone. I immediately hid the Bible under my pillow, and for the next 4 years, I never slept without it nearby. After that night, I didn't see the shadow again, but I still felt his presence sometimes. I'd catch glimpses of things brushing past me, and a sense of being watched would linger. For a while, I thought it was just my imagination, and I believed my mom's blessing of the house might have worked. But something happened recently that made me question if it was really gone. A few nights ago, I had an encounter with a little boy that made me think the shadow was still around, but perhaps he wasn't focused on me anymore. I'll write that story in another post. But I'm not sure what to think now. What I do know is that whatever is in my house, it still lingers. My sister also had an experience when we first moved in. She used to stay in the room that I now sleep in. One night, around 3 or 4 a.m., she woke up and sat up in bed, only to see a black figure standing over her. She felt strange about it, not understanding what was going on, but she was paralyzed with fear. The figure then jumped at her, pinning her to the bed. She remembers it being incredibly heavy. She turned her head toward the clock and saw the time. Then, she felt a pressure on her neck, and for a moment, she thought her blood was draining out. She felt as though she were dying. Then, just as suddenly, she woke up again, in the same position, and saw that hours had passed. She was terrified and didn't understand what had happened until I shared my experiences with her. That was the only encounter she had, and no one else in the house has seen anything, except for me. I still wonder what's in our house. What is the shadow? Why does it still hang around, and what does it want? I don't have all the answers, but I know I can't ignore it anymore. And sometimes, I'm afraid to be alone in that house, wondering if I'll see something else I can't explain. In 2003, my mom and stepdad bought a condo in Ennie, Ohio, only about 15 minutes east of where we lived. I only stayed there briefly since I was a senior in high school, and I planned to move out right after graduation. The development eventually became condemned in the summer of 2005 due to a flood, but that's not important for this story. My mom had bought the condo from one of her friend's mothers, who had recently passed away in the condo from natural causes. I never met the woman, but I heard she was a kind lady. However, I did learn that she had dabbled in witchcraft and black magic. I don't know the extent of her involvement, but I don't think she was a full-fledged witch or did anything harmful. It might have just been a hobby or something that interested her. When she passed, she left behind a lot of her furniture. Her family didn't need it, so my parents decided to keep some of her things. These included a couch, a couple of small coffee tables, and some hand-painted picture frames that were left on the living room walls. The paintings weren't anything too special, just typical mountain landscapes, with one featuring a Native American. Nothing about them seemed creepy or unusual at first glance. However, sometimes, late at night, when I was sitting on the couch, I'd notice that the cat and dog would stare at the paintings, their eyes wide and almost trance-like. It gave me chills. We never saw any solid proof, but we began to suspect that the condo might be haunted. It wasn't the usual things like flickering lights or strange sounds that raised our suspicion. It was something a little more peculiar. Twisty ties. Yes, the ones that come with loaves of bread from the store. Every now and then, we'd find these twisty ties scattered around the house. I know, it sounds strange. Our first thought was that the cat was somehow getting them and dragging them around. But then we started finding them in the strangest places, almost like they were placed there for us to notice. After I'd finish vacuuming and walk over to put the vacuum away, I'd turn around and find a twisty tie right in the middle of the living room floor, exactly where I'd just cleaned. Other times, they'd show up in the medicine cabinet, or on one occasion, I found one under my sheets when I went to bed. That one really freaked me out. I even found one wrapped around my toothbrush. This happened regularly enough to make it clear that it wasn't just a prank. The twisty ties would often be bent into random shapes, but nothing too specific. After about 2 years of this, I decided to look it up online to see if they had any significance in black magic or the occult. But I didn't find anything useful. Finally, I asked my mom about it. She told me that when the woman who had lived there was alive, she and her daughter had a little inside joke about saving all their twisty ties for later use. Apparently, it was something fun for them. While it might not have been anything too spooky, it was clear that we had a playful spirit in the house. And after all the strange occurrences, I started to think of it as a kind spirit, keeping the condo a little more interesting. From September 2005 to February 2006, my kids and I rented a house from a family friend in Northeast Ohio. It didn't take long after moving in on Conley Road before we started to realize we weren't alone. By the second week, I was walking down the hallway when something strange passed by me. As I walked past the bathroom, I saw a gray, rectangular shape move from the bathroom toward my bedroom, passing between my knees and feet. At first, I thought it was our cat, Dobby, but then I realized I didn't feel him brush against my legs. I remembered that Dobby was outside, so I went to let him in, just to be sure. A couple of days later, I saw the same shadow again, but this time, it was surrounded by sparkly white spots. Over the 5 months we lived there, odd things continued. The closet door in my bedroom would open by itself. I'd come home from work, and the door would be wide open. At first, I thought maybe I wasn't shutting it all the way, but one day, I was very careful to close it tightly. I left for lunch that day, made sure it was shut, and when I came back, it was wide open, pushed back against the wall. I shut the door again, then my daughter Jerica and I spent the afternoon opening and closing doors throughout the house, trying to figure out what might be causing it. We tested everything. I left the doors shut but not latched, and nothing made it swing open. Even opening the door further didn't make it move. The floors were level, which had actually impressed my boyfriend, who builds houses, when he did a walkthrough before we agreed to rent. Then, about 7 weeks into living there, something sat on the edge of my bed in the middle of the night. I felt the depression near my feet, which woke me up. When I moved my feet, the pressure lifted, and I realized no one was there. My son was asleep beside me, and I knew it wasn't Dobby. Whenever he climbed onto the bed, I could always feel him, but this time I didn't. Dobby also didn't leave the bed unless I physically moved him, and I could hear him land on the floor when he did. There were also several times when I'd hear interior doors shut, mostly at night. The only time it was my daughter, Jerica, shutting her bedroom door was once. The house was small enough that I could see down the hallway from the living room, and from my bed, I could see both kids' rooms and the bathroom. Since it happened so often, I'd always look when I heard the sound. Both of my kids heard the doors too. The hollow interior doors made a loud enough sound that it couldn't have been from a neighbor's car or house. I even checked. Around Thanksgiving, I was in my son's bedroom when I saw something strange. I walked over to his bookcase and saw a perfectly round, black sphere hovering in the air between the bookcase and the window. It was almost transparent. I stood there for what felt like at least 5 minutes, just watching it. I felt no emotion from it, just curiosity. Then, without any warning, it simply faded away. 2 weeks before Christmas, I was doing dishes on a Sunday afternoon while my son, Dalton, was sleeping and Jerica was at my parents'. Earlier that day, after we came home from Christmas shopping, Jerica had placed the CDs she'd picked out for herself on the kitchen table. As I was doing the dishes, I glanced over at the stack and tried to count how many CDs she had bought. They were stacked perfectly even, making it hard to distinguish one from another. I went into the laundry room, then came back to finish up. When I looked at the table again, the CDs were stacked in a way that made it easier to count them. Each CD was slightly shifted back, one by one. I was speechless. The fact that someone, or something, could almost read my mind and move the CDs to make it easier for me to count them was both unsettling and fascinating. Jerica had bought 13 CDs. About a year after we moved out, I finally decided to share my ghost experiences with Jerica, hoping I wouldn't scare her too much. She then told me that when we lived in that house, one day she had been looking at a picture of her sister, which I had hung in the hallway. She said that not only was her face reflected in the glass, but there was also another face there. I wish she had told me about it then. My fiancé and I were at home late the other night, 3 nights ago now, tonight being October 25th, 2010. We decided to take pictures because the situation seemed to warrant it, and what we captured was pretty amazing. For the past 3 nights, we've been noticing what looks like old, antique car tire tracks running through our yard in several places. We're sure no one has driven through our yard except for me on 2 occasions, but the tracks are much larger, with a completely different tread pattern than anything I would have left. On the night we were taking pictures, my fiancé called me outside. He said that while standing in the middle of one of the tracks, he felt a sudden, intense cold. I went out to see where he was standing, and he showed me the largest set of tracks that ran the entire length of our 2-acre property. I walked along the tracks, and when I reached a section where the tracks seemed to go through a tree in the yard, I immediately felt an intense chill. My ears went cold, and I got goosebumps, even though the temperature outside was warm. The next afternoon, my fiancé and I were standing outside looking at the tracks again when I felt a tug on my pants, right by my hip. I asked my fiancé if he had touched me, but he was standing about 4 feet away. It felt like a child had pulled on my pants, but there was no one near me. Later that night, while we were outside taking pictures, we captured some strange things. One photo seemed to show 4 small orbs, another appeared to show a tiny, childlike figure, and another showed what looked like a child's shadow with outstretched arms. There was also a photo with an adult shadow figure standing nearby. The tracks in the pictures seemed to be getting darker and deeper as we took more photos over the course of the hour. We had to adjust the lighting in our photo software to reveal some of the details, but the tracks themselves were clearly visible, even to the naked eye, both during the day and at night. I've tried talking to whoever, or whatever, might be outside. I told them they were welcome to stay, but I asked that they not harm us or run into the house or cars. It feels like the right approach for now, and we haven't had any problems. I've also been doing some research online about ghost portals and found this site. I believe there might be a portal on our property. Some of the photos show what appears to be a solid line shadow, almost like the side of a house. Interestingly, there used to be a house on this land, and there's a story that an old chest of coins, worth a lot of money, is buried somewhere among the rubble of the old house. No one has been able to find it yet. In one of the pictures, I also noticed a couple of small boxes off to the side, but I'm not sure what they are. Does anyone have any ideas about what they could be? We're not scared by any of this. We're just interested and curious. If someone is passing through our property, we'd like to help if we can. My fiancé's home seems to be a hot spot for activity as well. My grandfather has followed me wherever I've lived in the past, and he's also made his presence known in my fiancé's house. A few days ago, my fiancé rang the doorbell twice, and then my grandfather scattered my fiancé's cigarette tubes all over the floor. My fiancé also heard a deep, old man's laugh and then felt my grandfather grab his ankle and trip him. At times, my grandfather has also been shutting cabinets for me in the kitchen. I'm not sure if this activity is connected to what's happening outside in the yard, but I think it's worth mentioning. Also, years ago, my fiancé took pictures inside his house after he'd built a custom cabinetry for some fish tanks. When he reviewed the photos, he found images of his mother and grandmother in the background, even though they were long since passed. There were also some orbs in the pictures. While I'm not sure if all of this is connected to the current happenings in the yard, it definitely seems like there's something going on. The haunting in our house didn't really start to be noticed until my brothers and I began leaving for college. The house was built in the 1870s, and it wasn't until then that we began to realize something strange was going on. It all started with my dad, who worked third shift. He would complain that when he came home in the morning, before we were awake, he would find dry paper cups left beside the bathroom sink. We all denied doing this, night after night, until one day he joked, "Maybe we have a ghost." The first time we noticed something truly odd was when we all denied it, then went to bed after Dad left for work. When he came home, there was a cup again, right where he had left it. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was due to the heat register, but Dad remained convinced that something was off. So, one night, he decided to test it. He placed the cup in the exact spot, shut the bathroom door, and went to work. When he came home, the cup was flipped upside down with a new cup stacked on top. That was when we all agreed something weird was going on. The next night, Dad draped a tissue over the spot to see if it was the register causing the movement. When he came home, the cup was exactly where he had left it, with the tissue still on top. This ruled out the register. At this point, I started wondering if someone in the house was playing tricks. But that theory was put to rest when I played a joke on my dad one night. I placed the cup in the spot, trying to trick him. When we returned from dinner, I opened the bathroom door, and to my horror, the entire cup dispenser had been pulled from the wall and placed in the spot. I was terrified, and so was the rest of the family. Someone, or something, was clearly responding to us. The more we acknowledged it, the more the strange events seemed to escalate. My dad left a pencil in the spot one night, and in the morning, there was the cup with the pencil balanced on top. After that, he began writing small notes, questions like, "Who are you?" Often, we'd get strange responses, tiny check marks or X's. Once, we even got the initials, MC, written faintly. Later, we found out that a woman named Mabel Close had lived in the house in the 1920s. My parents had bought the house from her son, who had been estranged from her until her death. As time went on, the direct communication stopped, as things started to get too uncomfortable to live with. My dad kept track of the cups and the notes for years, documenting them in a calendar. This continued for over 20 years, though the frequency of occurrences dropped off from 3 to 4 times a week to about once a month. He still has every calendar and note. Then, one night, there was an actual sighting. My dad had always wanted to see her, but I had always said, "If you're here, I don't want to see you." One night, while my grandmother was visiting, my dad woke up to see someone standing at the foot of his bed. At first, he thought it was my grandmother, but as he focused, he realized it was a woman wearing a black paisley dress, with her hair in a bun. He said she had no face, just darkness. She stood there for a few seconds, then turned and glided across the floor, passing through the bedroom floor. The spot where she had stood was actually over a cedar chest. My dad was so excited that he called me immediately. He was out of breath. Other strange events occurred over the years. One night, when my mother was in the hospital after surgery and my dad was home alone, he heard heavy footsteps. He thought I had come home from college. The footsteps moved up the stairs and toward my bedroom door, then stopped, as if someone was trying to open the door but it was swollen. Then, the footsteps turned and came to his bedroom door. He said it sounded like a basketball being dribbled hard. He was terrified and asked whoever it was to stop scaring him. There were other odd occurrences. The doorbell would ring in the middle of the day with no one there. Faint voices or conversations could be heard almost every night while I was trying to sleep. These conversations were so frequent that I became almost afraid to go home. I'd hear the talking when I pressed my ear to my pillow, and though I knew it was English, I could never make out a single word. My dad later confessed that he had been hearing the same thing for years but never mentioned it to me because he didn't want to scare me. Small things would also disappear and then reappear. Balls would roll by themselves, and objects would vanish only to be found again in strange places. Now, over 20 years after we first became aware of Mabel, I still get chills when I visit my parents' house. She was as active at 3 p.m. as she was at 3 a.m. No matter when I tested her, she would respond immediately. I'd place an item over her spot, leave the room, and within 2 minutes she'd respond. It was strange and fascinating. I've always wondered about having a real investigation done, but even though I started as the ultimate skeptic, I've ruled out every possible explanation. The phenomena would happen whether anyone was home or not, whether my brothers were around, or my parents were away. There was no logical explanation, but what we experienced was definitely an intelligent haunting. In July of 2009, I bought a trailer and set it up on my parents' property. Nothing unusual happened at first, just the typical knocking on doors, shadows, and footsteps, until the night of October 10, 2009. My 2 oldest grandsons had spent the night. To set the scene, my daughter, Jerica, was at work. My little boy, Dalton, and youngest grandson, Jacob, were in Dalton's bedroom, TV on with the door shut. My oldest grandson, Blake, was in the living room watching an animated Batman DVD. My parents and I were sitting at the kitchen table playing Yahtzee. It was around 8:25 p.m., almost time for me to leave to pick up Jerica. The kitchen and living room were connected, one big room. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I heard a man's voice clearly say, "SHT." It wasn't in anger or to scare us, just a simple, matter-of-fact, "SHT." Like someone was standing near the TV, facing the kitchen, right at the end of Blake's feet. The word wasn't alarming, but it was completely unexpected. I looked at my mom and dad. Neither of them reacted. I thought to myself, I know I heard that. Blake, looking wide-eyed, turned to me and said, "Mimi, someone said a bad word." I asked, "You heard that too?" He said he did and then asked, "Who said that?" My parents still hadn't reacted, so Blake asked again, "Mimi, who said that?" I told him I didn't know and yelled for Dalton. Now Dalton's bedroom door was shut, and the TV was on, so I couldn't hear anything from his room. I finally got Dalton's attention, and when he came into the kitchen, I asked him if he had said a bad word. He looked at me confused and said, "What?" I asked again, "Did you say a bad word?" He insisted he hadn't, and I believed him. If Dalton had said a bad word, Jacob would have yelled loud enough for me to hear it from outside. So, I asked Dalton if Jacob had said a bad word, and he said no. He told me they were just playing in his room and wanted to know what bad word I was talking about. I told him it didn't matter what word it was, I just needed to know if either of them said it. But given that the voice sounded like an adult male, I knew it wasn't either of them, but I still needed to eliminate the possibilities. It was then time to leave and pick up Jerica, so I stopped the DVD and told Blake he could finish it when we got back. On the way to pick her up, Blake asked again, "Who said that bad word?" I told him I didn't know, but maybe it was on Dalton's Batman movie. Dalton quickly responded, "No, it's not. They don't say bad words in my movie." I told him he didn't know that for sure, and we'd watch it again when we got home. Dalton got a little heated, sticking to his guns, and insisted again that there were no bad words in his movie. I raised my voice and told him that he didn't know that for sure, and we'd watch it when we got home. That was the end of the discussion. After we returned home and everyone settled, we all sat down in the living room, and I rewound the DVD a bit and pressed play. We watched that entire episode on closed captioning, and there was nothing that could have been mistaken for the voice we heard. There was no talking at that point in the movie. Fast forward to April 21st, 2010. I was watching an episode of Ghost Hunters. During an investigation, two of the investigators asked for a sign that anyone was there. Typical questions like, "Is anyone here?" Out of nowhere, I distinctly heard the word "help" in response. The investigators didn't react at all, but I was sure I heard it. A moment later they asked, "Hey, what was that noise over there?" But it wasn't the noise they were talking about. I had heard the word "help." It sounded as clear as when I heard the sh*t months earlier. I couldn't believe it, but I knew what I'd heard, and I was certain of the time and place. Unfortunately, I drifted off during the analysis, so I never got to see if they caught the word "help" on their equipment. During the reveal, it wasn't mentioned. After realizing that maybe the ghost wasn't speaking to the investigators, but to me, I decided to try and communicate. I asked if the spirit needed help or if it was just trying to get my attention. I told it that I could hear it and was willing to listen. I sat quietly for a few minutes, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But nothing came through. I asked the spirit to knock on doors or walls, but there was no response. The word "help" was just as clear as the word "SHT. I know what I heard, and I'm certain of it. The strange thing is that both events, hearing SHT and "help," happened in roughly the same area, near the TV. Since Ghost Hunters airs reruns, I've watched that episode several times, paying very close attention, but I've never heard the word "help" again. I guess I should start by saying that in our home, we have at least two known ghost children, one boy and one girl. For those of you who've read my story, they want me to go with them. I don't believe these are the same children. Now, to get to the story. On July 7th of this year, after returning home from work, I noticed that the commode lid in my bathroom was down. This is something I never do, and neither does my little boy Dalton, especially since he wasn't even home the night before. Since we live on my parents' property, I thought maybe my dad had come down during the day and for some strange reason, shut the commode lid. I asked him about it, but he said he hadn't been down that day. No one had been home except our kitten, Rex, who was only about 5 weeks old, and my hamsters. If Rex could have climbed up onto the commode, he would have fallen in and drowned, but that didn't happen. So, I left the lid up after using the bathroom that night, and went to bed. Later that night, while I was dreaming, I became aware of something in my hand. I slowly opened my eyes just enough to see what I was holding. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, just that there was something in my left hand. When I woke up the next morning, my hand was still closed. I opened it, and there, in the palm of my hand, was a green satiny ribbon. Now, I don't keep ribbons around the house. All my Christmas and Halloween decorations are stored in a separate building, and I'm not into scrapbooking or anything like that. With my OCD tendencies, I would have either put something like this away or thrown it out. I have no idea where this ribbon came from or why I was woken during the night to hold it. I can't explain why I held it until morning either. The oddness didn't stop there. When I entered my bathroom the next morning, which is connected to my bedroom, I discovered that the commode lid was down again. This wasn't just any lid, it's one of the heavy kinds, not the plastic ones. It's very loud when it falls, and if I had heard it, I probably would have jumped out of bed. But no, the lid was down again. A week later, Dalton was in bed when he called for me. I was sitting at the computer, and I asked him what he needed, thinking it was another one of those nights where he couldn't sleep and would try to talk all night. But this time, he said, "Mom, I heard our ghost again." I asked him what was said, and Dalton replied. He just said Dalton. Here's the thing, when Dalton says his own name, he doesn't enunciate the T. He says, Dalen. But when he says that someone else says his name, like our ghost, he always emphasizes the T. It's always Dalton, with the emphasis on the T. When he told me that the little boy had called his name, I told him it was okay and to just lie back down. But a few minutes later, Dalton came out of the bedroom with a pillow and blanket and told me he was going to sleep on the couch. Within minutes, Dalton was fast asleep on the couch. This convinced me that he had indeed heard a little boy's voice and was scared enough to leave his bed, even with the light on and the reassurance that I was right there. Then, on July 25th, I woke up with a horrible headache. This kind of headache doesn't go away with my regular migraine meds. I have to sleep it off, which can take hours. So, I decided to try taking a bath, hoping the warm water might help relax me enough to sleep. I ran lukewarm water into the tub, because I couldn't bear hot water with the headache. It would have made me feel nauseous. As I lay down in the tub with my head under the faucet, I thought the water might help with the pressure on my forehead. Suddenly, the water turned completely hot, scalding hot. I shot up out of the water and yelled, "What the heck?" Yes, I said heck. And then I added, "That wasn't funny. It wasn't nice, and it wasn't funny either." Now, the natural assumption is that someone turned on the hot water, but Dalton didn't come into the bathroom. He hadn't run water in the kitchen sink because we only used cold bottled water from the fridge. And my bath/shower water never fluctuates. You can flush the toilets, run every sink, and even do laundry, and the water temperature in the bath won't change. So why did my water go from lukewarm to hot in less than a millisecond? After I adjusted the cold water, I realized the tub was nearly full. My tub doesn't have an overflow drain, so if the water hadn't gone hot, the tub would have likely overflowed. On Friday night, October 22nd of this year, I had a dream that I lost one of my diamond earrings. These earrings are very special to me. The only time I ever take them out is when I'm coloring my hair, and they go right back in once I'm done and have cleaned them. The dream was unsettling, and it stuck with me. So, on Saturday, I was extra conscious of my earrings, constantly checking to make sure they were still in place. By the end of the day, with both earrings safely in my ears, I thought maybe it was just a strange dream, nothing more. The next day, Sunday, I went through my usual morning routine. I made my bed, then spent some time in and out of the bathroom doing things like applying my makeup and fixing my hair, which require using the bathroom mirrors. Finally, I was ready to go, my hair pulled back as it usually is, with both earrings clearly visible in my ears. I have this subconscious habit of touching my earrings, especially my left one, when I'm driving. I often prop my left elbow on the windowsill of my truck and absent-mindedly play with the earring. It's just something I do. I was in and out of my truck several times throughout the day, so I didn't think anything of it. But later, when I got home that afternoon, I went inside, changed clothes, and then went back outside to power wash the back of my trailer. A couple of hours later, I was in my truck again, and as usual, I touched my left ear. But this time, I immediately realized that my earring was missing. My heart sank, and I felt this rush of panic. I knew there was no way I'd be able to find it. It could be anywhere. I was completely heartbroken. That night, when I got ready for bed, I pulled back the comforter and climbed in. As soon as I lay down, I felt something strange in my bed. I thought maybe my cat had dragged something in there, so I swept it off the bed and onto the floor. But then I heard a ting-ting sound, and in that instant I knew what it was. My heart leapt with excitement. I knew it was my earring. I quickly jumped out of bed, flipped on the light, and there it was, lying on the floor between my bed and my dresser. Not only was my earring there, but the back was still attached to it. I picked it up, put it back in my ear, and then got the other earring from the basket where I had left it earlier and put that one in too. When I laid back down, I couldn't help but thank them, over and over again, for finding my earring and putting it exactly where I would be able to find it. I told them how much those earrings meant to me, how grateful I was, and thanked them once more. This whole experience was incredibly moving. Over the years, I've had some truly strange and unexplainable things happen, but this event was beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Before I begin, I want to share that our house was built by my grandfather, who passed away before I was born. So, the house is fairly new, and the only death I know of is my grandfather's, who died of a heart attack in the shower. It all started when I was 8 years old and babysitting my 6-year-old cousin. We were playing a computer game, and like most kids our age, we had a small argument about something in the game. My mother and grandmother weren't expected to be home for a few more hours, and our basement was nearly hollow, so any noise upstairs, like a door opening or footsteps, could be clearly heard from where we sat. At the time, the basement was just a computer and a couch, with a dark closet a few feet away and a stack of board games on the other side. We were laughing about something after our small fight over a dress in the game when, out of nowhere, a raspy, strained voice called our names. We froze. Slowly, we turned our heads to look at each other, and I had this sinking feeling that my cousin had heard it too. At the time, she wasn't a good liar, but she became more secretive as she grew older. We hesitated for only a moment before we both jumped up and ran towards the stairs, my cousin leading the way. As we ran, we heard deranged laughter echo from the dark closet. Halfway up the steps, my cousin suddenly stopped in her tracks, leaving me to almost crash into her. I barely avoided her and kept running until I reached the top of the stairs. In my panic, I forgot about my cousin and collapsed on the living room couch, crying until my mother and grandmother came home. When they arrived, we went back downstairs to find my cousin lying on the floor, her eyes wide open and staring blankly at us. She didn't move or speak until my mom ran over and picked her up. My cousin later told me she passed out from fright after seeing bloodshot eyes watching us run away. I understand that my cousin might have been exaggerating, but the way she shook and cried when she told me what she had seen made me believe her. I can still remember the look of terror in her eyes. The second incident happened when I was 10 years old, playing with a stuffed kitten in my closet. My closet was filled with clothes and a few stuffed animals, but otherwise, it wasn't very big. Certainly not as large as my room. While my grandmother was making dinner in the kitchen, I played alone, and could hear her moving around, since only a door separated my room from the kitchen. When she finished, I heard her walk into the living room, but then all sound stopped. Once a noise moves further away from my room, it becomes inaudible. I was now alone and began talking to my imaginary friend, whom I named Marble. I had given her that name because of a shiny, colorful bag of marbles sitting on my dresser across the room. After a moment of talking to Marble in my head, I heard loud, heavy footsteps above me, in the attic. The attic hadn't been touched since my grandfather built the house. The door had been sealed off after his death for reasons unknown. I stood up, whispering frantically to Marble in my mind, and imagined she told me to grab the stuffed cat and run to the living room. Thinking it was just my imagination, I clutched the cat and darted out of the room into the living room, where I told my grandmother what had happened. I didn't mention Marble though. All my grandmother told me was to stay in the living room, and I didn't ask any further questions. To this day, I wonder what my cousin really saw in that closet and why my grandmother gave no explanation. Did my grandmother know who, or what, was making those heavy footsteps upstairs? Did my cousin possibly see something more sinister, like an intruder tormenting us? Another question haunts me. When I imagine Marble's advice, I thought it was just my imagination, but why did her voice sound so unfamiliar? It didn't sound like my own voice at all. When I was a little girl, my family moved around a lot, from state to state. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old at the time, and I had just turned 8 when we finally settled in Georgia. This story might sound cliché, and you may not believe it. I didn't believe it either when it happened. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But my little sister also saw her. It was midday, in the middle of fall, when my family pulled into the gravel driveway of an old 2-story house. My older sister, Rain *, immediately began claiming which rooms she would take, even though she hadn't even seen the inside of the house yet. When I stepped out of our old gold minivan, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't like that house. I didn't even want to step inside, but I reluctantly followed my sisters anyway. Once inside, the adults immediately went to talk business in the kitchen. As a child, I found it odd that the grown-ups didn't even see the house but still wanted to buy it. As I turned to point this out to my sisters, I realized they had both disappeared. I shrugged it off and started up the elegant flight of stairs. The house was grand, but something wasn't right. I soon came across a little door in the hallway. It was a random door, almost like it didn't belong. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. To my surprise, I found more stairs. Slightly irritated, I climbed the next set. Then, out of nowhere, my little sister, Cynthia *, slammed into me, sending both of us tumbling to the floor. "You little butthead!" I cried, but Cynthia just giggled and then became serious, whispering, "I don't like this place. It's weird." So, I wasn't the only one who felt that way. I nodded and helped her up. Together, we pushed through the door and landed on the old wooden floor of the attic. And there, standing in front of us, was a girl. She looked about my age, maybe a bit older. She had long, straight black hair, tied into sleek ponytails on either side of her face. Her complexion was pale, almost radiant, with full lips, a cute nose, and large dark eyes. She smiled and whispered, "Hello?" Cynthia, always the first to find her voice, asked, "Hey! We didn't know anyone was up here." The girl simply shrugged and said, "Well, here I am." I blurted out, "Do you live here?" Her eyes snapped to mine, and I quickly added, "Never mind," realizing I might have asked something strange. The three of us began chatting like we were old friends, talking about how weird adults were, and how they never listened. Then the girl picked up a penny from the floor. "You want to see a trick?" she asked, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. Cynthia and I nodded, eager to see what she would do. The girl slid the penny into her ear, tapped her head 3 times, and then held out her opposite hand. When she opened her hand, the penny was there. Our reaction was pure awe. Before we could say anything else, I heard the front door open downstairs. Panicked, I grabbed Cynthia's hand. "Sorry, but we have to leave now." "See you around?" I asked the girl. She just shrugged and said, "I suppose." We rushed downstairs and out the door, where my mom was waiting. She looked at us, eyes wide. "Where have you two been? You're filthy." "Sorry, Mommy," Cynthia said, but I blurted out, "We were just playing with the little girl in the attic." My mom stopped, puzzled. "What little girl? There's no little girl in the attic." Cynthia looked at me. I looked back at her. "Yes, there is." My mom just waved us into the car, apologized to the pale-looking realtor, and got into the driver's seat. Adults never listen. As we drove away, that feeling of unease crept up again. I turned around slowly, and my eyes went straight to the attic window. The girl was watching us. As the car pulled away, I could see her face more clearly. It was dark, but I saw her eyes turn black, the pupils swallowing her whole eye. When I saw the look on my face, she smiled. I blinked, and she was gone. When I got older, I learned that it's impossible for a person to put an object in their ear and have it come out on the other side. My sister has a better memory than I do, but I still remember this. To this day, my mother never listens when I say, "Stay away." I used to live with my friend John and his girlfriend Becky in a condo we shared together. They had moved in a few months before me, and from the start, they'd been telling me about strange occurrences in the place. All of us believed in the paranormal, but when I moved in, things had been quiet for the first couple of months. That is, until things started picking up. We'd hear strange growls coming from the basement. None of us felt comfortable going down there alone, so we always went in pairs. Sometimes, we'd see figures walking around, and objects would move on their own. Doors would close by themselves, just to give you an idea of the kind of activity we were dealing with. After several months of this, Becky suggested that we try something to make contact with whatever was there. She wanted to use a Ouija board. Despite my hesitation, I agreed. We had all gotten used to the strange happenings, but now we wanted to know what we were really dealing with. One night, we decided to give it a try. We were in John and Becky's room watching movies when we decided to head to the kitchen table to set up the board. Just as we were about to begin, John's friend, Jessie, came over. We asked her if she wanted to join, but she declined, saying she'd just watch. We set up the board and started recording on my phone to listen back later. At first, we asked some basic questions, but it didn't take long for things to take a much darker turn. John asked a few questions, and suddenly, he started to cry. When we asked what was wrong, he told us it was his grandma. He had been trying to contact her, but the answers started becoming more and more wrong. That's when we believed something else, something darker, came through. We continued asking questions, hoping for some clarity. John asked, "Do you know what or who is in our house?" The response we got was, "Yes." When he asked, "Is it evil?" the answer was, "Yes." Then Becky asked, "Is it strong?" And we got a chilling response, "Yes, DMON." At this point, we were all on edge. Becky asked, "How strong is it?" And the response came back, "DRY." My heart started racing. Then she asked, "What is its name?" The response sent a chill down my spine. "ZY." Becky asked, "What should we do?" And the answer was clear, "GTOUT." We all exchanged uneasy glances. She then asked, "How do we defeat it?" And again, the board spelled out, GTOUT. But this time, the letters started speeding up, cycling faster and faster. John and I were both terrified. I shouted, F***K this, we're done. Close whatever door you opened." John asked Jessie to grab his car keys from his room, but when she went to do so, she came back, visibly shaken, and said, "I can't, your door is locked." We rushed upstairs, and sure enough, the door was locked, even though we'd left it wide open before. We ran into his room, looking for his keys. After searching for about 10 minutes, we found them under the bed, where they shouldn't have been. Later that night, we listened to the recording from the session. At first, there was nothing. But as soon as we started asking about the demon, a growling sound slowly began to rise. By the time the board spelled out, "So," we could hear an eerie half laugh, half growl, followed by a chilling voice saying, "You are mine." We moved out within a month of that night. The whole experience had left us unnerved, but there was one last thing that happened when we went back to the condo to get the rest of our stuff. I was walking to the car when I suddenly felt like someone was behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. But when I got in the car, I noticed something odd. My metal crucifix, which had been perfectly intact when I entered the apartment, was now bent in the middle at a 45-degree angle. My name is Lauren, and I'd like to start by giving some background. The house I live in used to be my grandparents' house. They are still alive and now live down the road. When I was little, I used to stay here, but I never had any paranormal experiences. However, ever since I moved in with my mom in the summer of 2004, I've had several unsettling experiences, and the house has definitely felt haunted. We have a finished basement, and that's the part of the house we try to avoid. It's hard to avoid though, because our house is a split level. The basement is connected to our kitchen and laundry area, and the stair railings open directly into the basement. Whenever I walk down the stairs to the basement, I get an uneasy feeling. My hair stands up, and I can't help but feel like something is watching me. One week, my mom and I felt so unnerved that we couldn't bring ourselves to finish walking down the stairs. It felt like something was going to hurt us. Afterward, we saged the house, hoping it would help, and it did, for a little while, at least. For about a week, the activity seemed to lessen. There was a time when my friend Katie came over to visit, and we were putting groceries away in the pantry. After we returned to the living room, we heard a crashing sound from downstairs. We rushed to the basement, and found that everything we had just put away was now in the center of the pantry, arranged in a perfect circle. That was the first time we felt like something was really messing with us. Another time, I was in the jacuzzi tub in the basement when I saw a dark figure pass through the bathroom. It was so close to me that I could feel its presence. I didn't say anything to anyone at first, but I knew something was wrong. On yet another occasion, I was standing in the pantry when I heard a deep man's voice whisper, "Hello," right in my ear. I wasn't scared, but I didn't know how to respond either. When we started bringing things up from the basement that had belonged to my great-grandparents, I began to see shadows moving from my room to my mom's room, which are just across the hall from each other. It became so frequent that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Several people who had stayed over also saw a tall figure walking in the hallway or standing in the doorway, tipping its hat at them. One night, early after we had moved in, a music box on our baker's rack went off by itself, and a rocking chair began moving slowly. I felt an overwhelming sadness, and before I knew it, I was crying uncontrollably. A specific event stands out from one night when I was having a small party with about 10 of my closest friends. I had my EMF detector set up in the hallway. We were in the kitchen when we heard it going off, so we all rushed to the hallway and started taking pictures with our phones. One of the pictures clearly showed a white apparition standing in the hallway. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, while my mom snored in her room. I looked down the hall and saw the bathroom light turn on by itself. I couldn't explain it, and neither could my mom when I told her the next day. Things escalated further when I had ACL reconstructive surgery. My boyfriend had been staying on the couch in the living room with me to help me recover. One night, when he wasn't in the room, I was lying there, dozing off, when I suddenly heard someone breathing heavily right above me. I felt my hand being pulled upward, as though someone was trying to hold it. I screamed and sat straight up in a panic. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal, and this seems to follow me everywhere I go. When I stayed at a friend's house once, I had a vivid dream about a man in a coffin in the living room. When I woke up, I told my friend about the dream, and she said the man who lived there before her had killed his family and himself in that room, and there were blood stains under the carpet. So, the question remains, is it just me who has this connection to the dead, or is it simply the house I live in now that holds these spirits? It all began when I was around 7 or 8 years old. My parents decided it was time to move to the countryside, so we relocated to the outskirts of a small town called Hollandsbeek. We came across this beautiful house that looked straight out of a storybook, the kind everyone dreams of living in. We went inside to explore, and when we descended into the basement, a sense of dread washed over me. At the back of the basement, there was an opening. When my dad peeked inside, we saw remnants of the Underground Railroad, and the air felt heavy, as if someone was watching us. But we chalked it up to the feeling of being in a new house, so I didn't think much of it at the time. We continued our tour, moving upstairs, and then we discovered the attic. Stepping inside, the eerie atmosphere became even stronger. Something was definitely off, but we tried to push those feelings aside. One night, I was watching TV in the living room when something strange happened. Out of nowhere, the TV shut off. I didn't think much of it at first, and turned it back on. Not even 2 minutes later, it turned off again, and the room grew noticeably cold. Just as I was about to turn the TV on again, I saw what appeared to be a person sitting right next to me. Terrified, I jumped up and rushed to my room, not daring to go back downstairs for the rest of the night. Living in that house, strange occurrences became a daily part of life. The hallway light would turn on and off by itself, pots and pans in the kitchen would shift around as if someone was moving them, and I frequently heard what sounded like old-time music and voices coming from the basement. My brother even saw a blue ghost one night when he threw pennies at it in the basement. Doing laundry at night became a nerve-wracking experience because it always felt like someone was watching me, an unsettling sensation I couldn't shake off. One evening, my dad had some friends over, and they decided to explore the basement. They ventured into the area near the remnants of the haunted Underground Railroad. As soon as they stepped inside, they all felt an overwhelming dark presence, and it was so intense that everyone rushed out in fear. At that point, we didn't know much about the house's history, but one thing was clear: I did not want to sleep in my room. My sister had once told me that she had gotten up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and when she returned, she saw that my bed was floating in midair. I was terrified to sleep in that room after hearing that. One day, my mom was watching TV in the living room when she noticed the TV turning on and off by itself again. Frustrated, she said out loud, "Stop it, Frankie!" and the TV immediately stopped. That was when we realized one of the spirits was named Frankie. After that, things calmed down for a while, and we thought maybe the spirits had finally left us alone. But we were wrong. One day, my mom had a friend over, and as they were talking, my mom looked over and saw a small black girl playing peek-boo in the corner of the room. That was the last straw for us. We were ready to leave, but before we could move out, the landlord informed us that she was putting the house in the historic society, and that no children were allowed to live there anymore. After moving out of that house, the paranormal experiences didn't stop. No matter where we moved, we always encountered spirits. Even as I write this, I can hear voices and strange banging sounds around me. I did some EVP recordings and discovered that we have 5 spirits. 3 of them seem to be good, while 2 are not so friendly. I'm still waiting for them to communicate with me more, but as of now, I haven't experienced any physical attacks. I've come to realize that the ghosts follow me wherever I go. I'm no longer afraid of them. As long as you don't mess with them, they usually won't mess with you. But living with spirits has become a part of my life now, and I've learned to accept it. It all started when I was about 7 or 8 years old. My parents decided they wanted to move out to the countryside, and so we relocated to a small town called Hollandsburg. We found an old house on the outskirts, and it was beautiful, exactly like the kind of house you read about in books, the kind everyone dreams of living in. The moment we arrived and went inside, we explored every room, and everything seemed normal, except for one thing: the basement. It gave off a strange, unsettling vibe. There was an opening in the back, and when my dad looked inside, he found what seemed to be remnants of the Underground Railroad. It was as if there was something, or someone, watching us. But we brushed it off, thinking it was just the feeling of being in a new home, unfamiliar and full of history. As the weeks passed, things started to feel a little off. One night, while I was sitting in the living room watching TV, the television suddenly turned off by itself. I thought it was just a glitch, so I turned it back on. But then, not even 2 minutes later, it turned off again, and the room started to feel cold. I tried to turn the TV on once more, but this time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure sitting next to me on the couch. I jumped up, terrified, and ran straight to my room. From that point on, I never felt alone in the house again. Small, unsettling things started to happen all the time. I would hear the hallway light flickering on and off by itself. Pots and pans would mysteriously move in the kitchen when no one was around. On a few occasions I heard old-time music and voices coming from the basement, but when I went to check, I found nothing. One day, my brother even saw a blue figure in the basement, while he was throwing pennies at it. Every time I had to go down to the basement to do laundry, I felt like someone was watching me. It was impossible to shake the feeling that something was always there, lurking in the shadows. Then, one night, things escalated. My dad had some friends over, and they decided to explore the basement. As they ventured down to the area near the Underground Railroad remnants, something strange happened. They all felt an overwhelming sense of darkness, as if a heavy presence was watching them. They all ran out of the basement in terror, and I knew something was very wrong in that house. I still didn't know much about the history of the house at that point, but I soon realized that I wasn't the only one experiencing these strange occurrences. One night, my sister told me that she had gotten up to go to the bathroom, but when she returned, she saw my bed levitating in midair. I was so terrified that I refused to sleep in my room after that. One day, my mom was sitting in the living room, watching TV when she noticed the television turning on and off by itself. She finally said, "Stop it, Frankie!" And to our surprise, the TV immediately stopped. That was when we realized that one of the spirits in the house might be named Frankie. Things calmed down for a while after that, and we thought we were finally free of whatever presence haunted the house. But we were wrong. A few days later, my mom had a friend over, and as they were talking, my mom glanced over and saw a little black girl playing peek-boo in the corner of the room. That was the moment we decided we had to leave. But before we could move out, the landlord told us she was putting the house in the historic society, and that no children would be allowed to live there anymore. Even after we moved out, strange things continued to follow us. Every place we lived after that seemed to be haunted. It was as if the spirits were always there, no matter where we went. To this day, I still hear voices and strange noises, and I've even done some EVP sessions to try and communicate with them. What I've discovered is that we have 5 spirits in the house. 3 of them seem friendly, but 2 are not so pleasant. I've learned that these spirits seem to follow me wherever I go. I used to be scared, but I've come to accept them as part of my life now. I've realized that as long as I don't provoke them, they usually don't cause any harm. It's become a normal part of my reality, and I've learned to live with it. After all, they don't seem to want to hurt me, and as long as I respect them, I hope they'll continue to leave me in peace. In May of 1978, just 2 months before I turned 13, my parents bought the house where we currently live. Before I share my experiences, I think it's important to give you some background on the house itself. The house we moved into was quite old, and it had a history. In 1997, it flooded badly. One afternoon, I was the only one home while my mom and one of her friends were up the road at my aunt's house, taking showers. It had only been a few days after the flood, so the house was still covered in mud, water, dirt, and trash. At that time, there were no working utilities in the house, so everything had been shut off. I was just sitting there, waiting for them to come back, when I heard a strange noise. The furnace, which obviously shouldn't have been working, kicked on. Now, I knew there was no electricity, and that the furnace shouldn't have been running, so I quickly rushed to my aunt's house to tell my mom. She didn't believe me at first when I said the furnace had turned on. She told me, "There's no way the furnace could have turned on. We don't have any electricity." But when we all went back, we heard it too. We could clearly hear the furnace running. We left the house pretty quickly after that. A few weeks later, an older man and his grandson stopped by the house. The man said my parents had given him permission to fish in the creek nearby. As we talked, he mentioned that his grandparents had once lived in this very house. Later, when my parents came home, I told them about this strange visit. They seemed intrigued, so my mom decided to speak to the old man when he came back up from the creek. She asked him about the house, and though I'm not sure exactly what she asked him, he said something that struck us all as odd. He told her that his uncle, a man named Jake, used to raise tables in the bedroom where my younger sister and I stayed, which also happened to be where the furnace was located. And now, my own experiences in that house. It didn't take long for things to start happening. Just a few nights after we moved in, my sister and I were in our bedroom when we heard a loud crashing sound from the living room. We both jumped up and ran to our parents' room. When we told our mom, she brushed it off, saying it was just the dogs under the house. But we knew better. We were scared because it was so loud, and it didn't sound like anything the dogs could have done. The next morning, we found nothing had fallen. I started having nightmares almost every night I slept there. They were always the same 3 nightmares, though I can only remember 2 of them clearly. The third one was so terrifying that I blocked it from my memory. But I distinctly remember having the same 3 nightmares over and over again, each more vivid and frightening than the last. And I was always terrified when night fell. Even as an adult, I avoided going there in the evenings. I'd leave the house before dark to avoid being alone there. When I was 16, one night I woke up in the middle of my sleep, and something inside me told me to go to the kitchen and take my mom's knife from the drawer. A chilling urge came over me, and for a moment, I actually considered it. At that time, I was the perfect, good girl. I never caused any trouble. I went to church every week, and I had a strong sense of right and wrong. I had never even been tempted to do anything wrong in my life, but here I was, ready to harm my own family. It wasn't like I heard a voice telling me to do it. Rather, it was a feeling, an overwhelming compulsion. I felt like I was being guided to that knife, but when I had my hand on the handle, something snapped in me. I woke up and realized what I was about to do. I quickly let go of the knife and rushed back to my room. I'm convinced that had I not had that moment of clarity, I would have done something horrible that night. I never told anyone about this. I kept it to myself for 17 years, unable to explain why I almost hurt my family. I didn't know what had come over me, and I didn't want to tell my parents. After all, how do you tell someone you almost killed them without knowing why? As the years passed, I often wondered why this happened to me. What was it about me that made me susceptible to this influence? Why me, and not my sister, who shared a room with me? I began to think maybe something about my sister and I made us different, something that this entity sensed, since we had very different beliefs about the supernatural. It wasn't until the house was rebuilt, after it had flooded, that the feeling of malevolence disappeared. After the flood and the renovations, it seemed like whatever evil was there was gone. There was still a woman and a child lingering, but the sinister presence associated with Jake was no longer there. I truly believe that God cleansed the house in His own way. Since moving out and leaving that house behind, I've had some peace. But the experience has stayed with me. And whenever I reflect on it, I'm reminded of just how close I came to something terrible. I still don't know exactly what it was that tried to take control of me, but I know now that I don't take my sense of safety and security for granted anymore. Something inside me tells me that God was protecting me that night, and I'm thankful for that every day. Let me start by saying that for the first 20 out of my 22 years of life, I was a complete skeptic when it came to the paranormal. I had never experienced anything strange, and I had no reason to believe in ghosts or spirits. I dismissed every story anyone told me, and I always said, "I'll have to experience something myself to believe it." That all changed last year when I moved into an apartment in Akron, Ohio, with a friend of mine, Sean. Before I get into the strange stuff, let me describe the apartment. It was a 2-floor place. When you entered, the living room was to your left, with an open area next to it that could have been used as a dining room, though we left it empty. Beyond that was the kitchen. To the right, a staircase led up to Sean's bedroom, and there was a walkway beside it that led to my bedroom. Sean's room was directly above mine. Now that you have a mental picture of the apartment, let me tell you the backstory. Sean and I worked the same shift at a factory, and we'd often talk at work. One day, out of the blue, he told me, "I think Bob followed me again." I looked at him, puzzled, and asked, "Who's Bob?" Sean told me that Bob was the spirit who had followed him throughout his life, from one place to the next. I laughed it off, thinking he was just messing with me. I mean, a spirit named Bob? Apparently, Sean had given it that name when he was a kid. I teased him about it for a while, but then he said, "Bob doesn't like it when people disrespect him or don't believe." I shrugged it off, saying, Yeah? If Bob is real, he can come meet me anytime." I continued poking fun at the whole thing. For a few days, nothing happened, and I forgot all about it, until things started getting weird. It all started in July of 2011, with small, unexplainable things. Objects would be moved from where we left them, or we'd come home from work to find lights on that weren't on when we left. We worked second shift, so this was late at night. These things didn't scare me, but they puzzled me. I tried to ignore them, but after a while, I started hearing things that couldn't be easily dismissed. One day, we were at a bar down the street, and Sean's old roommate was there. Somehow, we ended up talking about Bob, and his old roommate started telling me stories of strange things that had happened when he lived with Sean. I still didn't believe him, but the next few days brought more odd occurrences that I couldn't explain away. A couple of nights later, my girlfriend and I were at the apartment, watching Paranormal Activity, ironically, when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs, Sean's room. She looked at me, half scared, half amused, and asked, "Are you serious?" I hadn't told her about Bob, since I didn't believe in any of it at the time. I shrugged it off and said it was probably just the neighbors. But then, the noises stopped, and we laughed it off before heading to bed. Later that night, we were lying in bed, still alone in the apartment, when a loud bang hit my door. It was like someone had thrown a punch into it. My girlfriend jumped up and asked, "What was that?" I was startled too, but I tried to downplay it, telling her it was just the movie messing with our heads. But I opened the bedroom door to check, and there was nothing. The lights were off, and everything seemed normal. I couldn't explain it, but I told her to forget about it and go back to sleep. To be honest, I didn't sleep well that night. Something felt off, like there was a presence in the room. The next day, I told Sean about what happened, and he just laughed and said, "I told you, Bob doesn't like you." I brushed it off, still skeptical, and Sean warned me, "Bob doesn't like being called out." That night, I actually went home and apologized to Bob. And for a while, nothing happened. But the next time things got weird was in December. I was alone in the apartment, smoking a cigarette in the living room. Sean was out, and my girlfriend was away visiting family. After I finished my cigarette, I was about to head to my bedroom when I heard a loud bang from upstairs, like a dresser being slammed against the wall. I froze. I heard footsteps upstairs, and then everything went quiet. I called Sean, told him what happened, and said I wasn't going up there alone. At first, he said, "Okay, I'll check when I get home." But then he told me to go check on his pet lizard. Reluctantly, I went upstairs, and what I saw shocked me. The first thing I noticed was that a picture Sean had hung on the wall had somehow flown off, landing at least 10 feet away with the glass shattered around it. Then I saw the lizard's tank. The heat lamp that was sitting on top of it had somehow flown off, through a narrow gap between the dresser and the tank, and landed on the floor, its bulb shattered. This was in the middle of winter in Ohio, and there were no windows open, no drafts. It didn't make sense. I called Sean and told him what I'd found, and he got mad, yelling, "I told you not to anger Bob." I defended myself, telling him I'd apologized, but he insisted, "Bob doesn't like you." That night, I called my girlfriend and told her about Bob. She was freaked out, but after that, things quieted down for a while, aside from some minor incidents. Then, in March, I was at work when I started feeling an intense burning sensation on my back. When I showered that night, my girlfriend pointed out that I had 3 scratches running down my back. They looked like they had been made by something with claws. We didn't have any pets, and I hadn't done anything the night before to explain it. We were both shaken. Nothing happened again for a while, until one night, we were sitting around the living room with friends, talking about Bob because weird things had been happening again. That night, Sean and the others went out to the bar, but my girlfriend and I stayed in. We were getting ready for bed when suddenly, an alarm started blaring from upstairs. I thought it was the smoke alarm, but when I went up to check, I discovered it was coming from a music player Sean had hooked up to his phone. I unplugged it, and the alarm stopped. I called Sean to let him know, and he said, "That thing doesn't have an alarm." I was freaked out. That was the last strange thing that happened before we moved out a month later. My girlfriend and I found our own place, and since then, we've had no more experiences. Needless to say, all of this turned me from a hardcore skeptic into a full believer. The unexplainable events changed my perspective on the paranormal forever.